everyone, and welcome to our fourth annual 19th Represent Summit. I'm Emily Ramshaw, co-founder and CEO of the 19th, and we are so glad that you're here with us. Over the next 3 days, we're exploring how gender equality intersects with technology, justice, and economic mobility. We'll hear from public officials, leading organizers and CEOs, as well as musicians and poets. Together, we'll celebrate successes, identify barriers, and most important, learn with and from each other. The first 2 days of our summit will be virtual. The third day, Saturday, will be a hybrid experience, live streamed, but also live in person in downtown Chicago. I hope to meet many of you there. Visit summit.19thnews.org for more information. Before we begin, I want to thank those who made this week possible, including our founding sponsors, the National Women's Law Center and the Stardust Fund, as well as our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation and the Tory Burch Foundation. We'd also like to thank our national media partner, The Washington Post, as well as our local media partners, Block Club Chicago, CityCast Chicago, City Bureau, and the Chicago Independent Media Alliance. An extra special thanks to our academic partner, Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, which is hosting the in-person portion of our summit. A quick note that while sponsors help to keep the 19th Represents free for all viewers to attend, they play no part in our event programming. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our first conversation of the day about what representation looks like in the highest levels of the tech industry. Tatum Hunter, consumer technology reporter at The Washington Post, will lead this conversation.
Hi, I'm Tatum Hunter, a technology reporter at The Washington Post. We're kicking off today's conversations by talking about gender, equity, and representation in the C-suite. Joining me to do this is Padmasree Warrior, founder, president, and CEO of Fable.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. How are you doing, Tatum?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it. It's an important topic, isn't it?
Absolutely. So how often would you say that you talk about this topic? And when you do, where are you usually?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we talk about it more than I would like to, but at the same time, I feel it is an important topic to talk about. So I am usually at various conferences, sometimes in board meetings, sometimes at events that are promoting diversity and inclusion, to encourage others to talk about it and be open and lend their voice and lend their support to the movement that we hope we are driving. So yeah, I think it is a conversation that I have often.
And how does the conversation differ when you're on a panel or at a conference compared to like when you're with your girlfriends or when you're with like mentors, mentees, or trusted women colleagues?
My own experiences, what I have learned, it's more, I would say, sharing my journey, what I have learned, in the hope that it might help others go through their journey and make it maybe more seamless than I have had, maybe be better equipped to deal with the barriers that we all face in our careers. I think it's usually that context if I'm talking to people at conferences and talking about the importance of having representation in the C-suite, but actually all along the pipeline inside tech companies. If I'm just talking to a bunch of friends and we are debating this issue, I would say it's more likely we are collaborating on what we could do better, what we could have done different in our own experiences. It tends to be more about what could we have done better and what are we each doing to drive this forward, whereas at conferences, more sharing my experiences, I would say.
Totally. And I like that you kicked that off by saying I talk about it more than I'd like to, because it's also like, I think that we have done a lot of talking in the last few years about how it is emotional labor to think about these issues and to talk about them. And I think most people who are directly affected, I bet, are like, I'd love to never talk about this again.
I know it's both that, and I also feel like it's important we should talk about it, but it's also unfortunate that we have to talk about it. I wish we had made so much more progress that we don't need to bring this up as if it's a problem that we need to solve, and I think it versus like it's something we should just do, but we're not there yet, and therefore it is important to talk about it, and it's important to discuss it. It's important to put put this issue front and center for everyone. But part of me is like, why is this even an issue? Why are we even talking about still? Why are we not seeing the results that we should be seeing? Why is this not a non-issue in this day and age, right? And it's not, it is still an issue. So we have to talk about it, I guess.
So for people who are unfamiliar with this conversation, maybe, like let's set the scene of what the problem is. So women, for anyone who doesn't know, are about half of people, but they make up a much smaller percent of the technology workforce and leadership positions at big companies and high earning tech companies. So today, like I hear people say, every company is a tech company nowadays because of the important role that software plays in so many products and services. So do you think that because of that movement forward in our the tech that we develop and offer, are women and people of color in a worse position because of their underrepresentation in technology and STEM jobs?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, right? Like, as you pointed out, women for sure are half the demographic in the world, but they're definitely not half the workforce in tech companies. And yeah, every company is a tech company in the sense that technology is really an integral part of whatever business you're in and literally whatever part of the world we are in, if it's insurance or banking or finance systems, retail, even groceries, you name it, technology is really central to all of this, right? And so are women and people of color worse off in the sense that do we have the equal opportunity at these sorts of roles? I think we are at a disadvantage for many reasons. I think historically, these industries have been primarily, and these disciplines, I would say, technology in general has been very much male-centric and white male-centric. And, I think women were often seen as having soft skills and maybe don't have the right skills to be doing the hard jobs in technology, right? Like engineering and STEM in general, science and technology was seen as something that was not right for women in particular. And I think the same would apply for people of color. And I think in that sense that we're not there, enough of us are not there at senior levels inside these companies to create a strong pipeline of women and people of color to make sure the representation exists in all areas inside the companies, in creating products and marketing the products and understanding what customers want, how do we serve people with our products at all levels in every function. We need to have that right representation, and we're not quite there yet. Yeah.
So you just mentioned this talent pipeline, which is a term that comes up a lot in conversations about representation in tech. And some people say that part of the lack of diversity and representation is that there's not enough people receiving the training and education in these STEM and computer science fields. Other people say, no, that's, an elaborate front for companies who are not willing to usher these people in. What's true, and how much attention do you think the talent pipeline deserves?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely deserves attention, right? Because we want to have more women and people of color entering science and engineering and technology fields all the way from, I would say, schools into colleges to advanced degrees and then start careers and hopefully have successful careers. So definitely deserves attention. I think sometimes companies do use it as a crutch to say, it's easy to say, well, we don't have a pipeline, so we're not going to hire women and we're not going to keep them in the roles. But I think that crutch shouldn't exist. I think there is enough of women and people of color in the pipeline. It's not, we would like to get more, but there is enough for us to be able to recruit. But we have to make an effort to say every job that's posted, we are going to interview, make sure the candidate slate has women and people of color and it doesn't just, not have representation on the slate. The other thing I think we can do better inside companies is making sure the women and people of color that we do have inside companies have a strong career path to move forward, and that they're not leaving the companies at a faster rate, which has happened, unfortunately, during the layoffs. Typically, it's women and people of color that get affected more. They leave the workforce at higher numbers than others. And so those, I think, are other ways we need to work on, in addition to making sure the pipeline is there. How do we retain the people that we do have, the women and people of color we have inside our companies? How do we retain them? How do we develop them? How do we help them grow? How do we give them, the opportunity to rise to the top levels inside these companies?
Yeah, and feel welcome and supported
Exactly.
as they go through that journey. So right now, based on the numbers that I see, about 30% of the tech workforce is women, and about 20% of computer science grads are women. I'm sure there are some people out there who would say that, sounds great. What a success. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, in the computer science, that number, has been the same for the last, I would say, many years. And so while it's okay, I mean, I guess the good news is it hasn't dropped, it hasn't gone up either. And women, by the way, I think there is additional data that says women actually graduate at a higher rate and have better grades than men do in these disciplines. So when we are in those programs, we do better. And so I think that's interesting. And the 30% number is heartening, but it's not, it's not 50%. It should be 50%, right? And so while I think I think what the good news is that this is getting the spotlight it deserves to get. And it's definitely on every company's agenda to get more women and people of color into their workforce and help them develop in their careers. I think that's the good news. When I started my career, that was not even a topic that was discussed. I think so in some sense there's progress, but the results are not quite where they need to be. And so there's still work that needs to get done. I think the other thing, as you pointed out, I think you used the word make them welcome. I think that's just such a key thing. Once I mean, even in my own career, I face this. When you do have, I actually like to talk about a word that I call often I use is belonging versus inclusion. Inclusion means you get a seat at the table, but belonging means that you actually feel like you belong at that table. And I think companies need to start talking not just about inclusion and diversity, but actually how do we make people of color and women feel like they belong in these companies and the cultures, and how do we get to be who we are to be successful? I think that's the next step we need to take in terms of evolving the cultures inside companies.
I love that point because it's so interesting to notice how our language has evolved. Like we used to say tolerance, which now you're like, oh, thanks, and then inclusion, and then your word belonging. And it's easy to see how the question underpinning it all at the end is like, whose table is this?
Right.
And when am I being invited? And when is it mine?
Exactly, right? I mean, there's a huge difference. The words seem like they're small. And sometimes when I talk about, people are like, oh, what's the difference? There is a difference. Diversity to me means you are hiring people that are different from each other. That's great, right? Equity means you're treating them all the same, which is great. Inclusion means everyone gets a seat at the table. You're including me in your culture. Belonging means it's my culture. I'm there shaping it. My voice is heard. I get to play a bigger role in it. I think there is a big difference. And I think what we saw in the last few years with the Me Too movements, Black Lives Matter, it's all about people feeling like they don't belong. You may have invited me to be at the table. You may have asked me for my input, but I was not the one, shaping what the culture should be. It's still being shaped by somebody else. And I'm still sort of like, you're opening the door, but it's not something that I feel like I can be myself to be welcome at. And so I think it is taking that discussion to the next level. I feel that's really, really important these days.
So you are a corporate leader. So this is a little bit outside of your maybe realm of expertise. I don't know. But you've talked about what hiring managers and companies can do and what these training places, like universities and boot camps could do. Any advice for parents and educators? Because at one point you weren't a business leader, you were a little girl with all of this promise as a technologist. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm a parent as well. And, I think I have a son, and I often say my son is more of a feminist than I am. I think, what we do at home, the messages we send at home influence us, right? I think it's our experiences shape. I grew up in India, and our experiences shape who we become as human beings, and who we are as human beings influence who we are as leaders. All these things are intertwined. I often say, when people ask me about balance, I often say, look, I have one life. I don't have a work life and a family life. I have one life. And in that life, I have my work and my family and my personal things that I care about. So my advice to parents, especially if you're a parent raising a child who is not white and who's not male, is like encourage them that their differences actually could be their power. I think in a world where technology is really advancing at a tremendous pace, we need that humanity, we need that human perspective, which is not homogenous, to shape the products that we build. At my company, I'm now an entrepreneur. I've left the corporate world and I'm now a founder of a company. We often say we are a tech company with the soul of an artist. I think it's really important to bring even arts and that perspective about thinking about products from various perspectives, like you would look at a painting from different perspectives. Even that is important. So yeah, encourage your child to develop that broader perspective, encourage their interest, not just in one field, but in all fields, and bring their true self to whatever they do. I think authenticity is so important more and more in this world.
I love that answer because it's not like, yes, buy your little girl, a coding robot, and that might be it. But it's instill in this little person the idea that wherever they're interested in being, they belong and they have something of value to offer.
Absolutely.
Um, I love that. So you mentioned a minute ago how this recent round of tech layoffs that people may have seen in the headlines disproportionately impacted women and people of color. And I'm sure for a lot of people, especially people in tech who have had all these conversations over the last 3 years about how we can do better, I'm sure it can be very disheartening to hear statistics like that. How can we hold companies accountable to the DEI promises they make in public when behind the scenes, it feels like things can fall apart so quickly?
Yeah, I think part of it's probably part of the layoffs, but also people leaving the workforce. I think even before the layoffs, more women left the workforce voluntarily even. I think during the lockdown, when we were all working from home, I think there is data that talks about a disproportionate amount of the workload of taking care of if you're a parent, you're taking care of your children, their schooling at home, your own work, you're on Zoom calls working and taking care of everything that needed to be taken care of at home. Or if you have senior parents, caring for them as well as work, a lot of that load and the stress fell more on women and more on families of color than it did others. And I think that itself caused more of a need, I think, for flexibility. And women, I think we, women especially, I can speak to this, feel like we cannot compromise and we hold ourselves to much higher expectations. And I think we work harder in these situations, so we tended to burn out more. I think where companies could have done better is that understanding, and not necessarily doing special things for women, but just like saying, I think training their managers to be more empathetic and saying, even, I understand what you're going through, right? Like oftentimes that's enough. It's not, I don't think women or people of color are asking companies to go out of their way to accommodate their needs, but it's that understanding and the empathy that I think leading with empathy, leading with compassion. I think making sure we are using those sorts of skill sets to train first level managers, mid-level managers, where a person going through all of this and then having to do with the pressure of the job is just too much, and women say, okay, I quit, right? I think that happened a lot right after the pandemic, and we lost more women and people of color voluntarily, and then the layoffs came on top of that. So I think it's like one thing after another that added up, in my opinion.
And I think your point gets at that there's not a single solution. And it's not, and companies aren't the only people who can help or harm. It's the rest of society too helps support people as they move into leadership roles. So I think as women in particular, you mentioned perhaps this tendency a lot of women have to hold themselves to this really high standard. I think another thing that I hear people talk about a lot is imposter syndrome. Is feeling like I'm here, but only because no one's noticed yet, or something like that. And for me, a big moment that I had as somebody in the tech industry, a big moment I had with imposter syndrome was when I realized that it's not embarrassing to be stupid or to not know something, and that I don't have to let people fast talk me. I can just be like, nope, didn't get that, try again. And that was a huge moment for me. I'm curious if you've had anything similar where you're like, oh, like I'm allowed to be here, and here's why.
Absolutely. I think we all have it, and in different ways. I think in my case, it was sort of, I'm brown. I came from India. When I came to this country, I'm small. You can see me maybe on Zoom. I'm not as tall, and I think people didn't take me seriously. I think they just felt like, even when I was growing into bigger and bigger leadership positions, people always thought of me as a good engineer, and didn't think of me as like someone who has strategy, who can drive the business side of thing. I think usually, by the way, I think we also put people in functional silos. If you're an engineer, you must be a good engineer. If you're a marketer, a good marketer, but can you be a good business leader? And I think it's like you fight these battles I had to fight these battles on many fronts. I'm a woman, I'm a brown person, and I'm an engineer. And by the way, I can be a business leader too. And so I think each of these things you feel like you have to knock down, and you always feel, and maybe a lot of women go through this, you always feel like I have to be perfect at everything. I don't get any breaks, or I won't get the chance to move up. And I think you put that pressure on yourself, and you keep, like, the bar keeps rising, and you keep thinking, I'm not good enough. I have to work harder to meet that bar. That happens to all of us, right? I think at some point you realize, and I realized in my career, like, okay, forget this. I'm actually better than everybody else in this sense. And I don't need to feel like I have to prove myself at every step of the way. And you get that self-confidence in who you are. And you realize, like, this is my superpower. I'm going to use this superpower to make sure that people recognize this is my strength. And that's the advice I give people, even my own team now, when I coach them. I try to identify for them what I see as their superpower. Sometimes we get blindsided. We don't see our own strengths often, right? And so someone else, and I try to do that when I'm mentoring people and coaching them, I try to point out, hey, I see this as like your superpower. This is so great. You're so good at this. You should always make sure you're holding on to that superpower. You use it, right? Because we all have to learn new things as we grow in careers, but we're also really good at certain things. I think it's just that self-awareness of realizing what you're really good at and acknowledging you're not an imposter. Everybody has to learn something, and that's just normal. It's just not just you that have to learn something new, right? And so, it's that realization that I think you get somewhere in your career that opens up your eyes. Yeah.
I also love that. I feel like what you said about working with your team, it's totally possible to pull the camera back and remember that when we talk about women or people of color fitting in a tech company, it's not because they are somehow lacking some skill or background to fit in. It's that the context and the water they're swimming in is discounting their strengths, failing to see their strengths, failing to make room for their strengths. And I think that can be helpful to remember too, where it's not that I'm underrepresented because people like me don't cut it. It's because this environment wasn't built for us.
That's right. And it's set in its ways and it hasn't evolved, right? And, maybe it needs to change rather than you changing to fit in. So I think that's what I mean by belonging. Like the culture needs to adjust and it needs to be shaped by the people that are coming into the workforce now that are very different and bring a different perspective versus saying, here's what it is. And this is, by the way, been defined by us by 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And you now have to fit into this culture. And therefore, you are made to feel like an imposter. Yeah, it's just a very different. It needs to be more fluid to allow for that new people coming in to shape what that culture is going to be.
So I feel like we've touched on this a couple of times during our conversation, which is that the words we use matter because they influence reality, and then reality influences our words, and it all moves in a big circle. So if there's one thing that you could change about the discourse and the discussions that we're having right now about underrepresented groups in tech and leadership, what would you shift and change?
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, I don't know, this is not to say that DEI are not important, but I would shift the conversation to, and I do this, by the way, when I talk to companies, I force leaders to think about, do you have a culture of belonging? Do you allow people to feel like they belong no matter what they are? Maybe my hair color is different from the rest of the people, and that's okay. This is how I want to be, and I want to belong, and I still am invested in the company. Are you fostering that? Versus just checking the box saying I've hired people that are different and therefore I'm okay. So I think we need to shift that conversation. So I'm not necessarily saying replace DEI because we haven't quite gotten to that point yet, but I want to introduce the word belonging into people's vocabulary.
And then last question from me, what are companies, or even just one company that stood out to you, doing that you think is a win and that you think is a step in the right direction?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a one company, but I can think of companies that are doing things, I think, differently, which is recognizing that human connections are important. I don't know if you saw, by the way, there's a new report that has just come out from the US Surgeon General's office that talks about how mental wellness, human connections, these things are really, really important. And I think a lot of stress, and I mean, this is the mission of my company too, acknowledging that wellness is holistic and for people to feel like they can be connected to others helps us contribute more. So I think companies that are recognizing this, and I actually applaud the US Surgeon General's office for really calling this out, because so much of our life is spent at work, right? Working. And if we don't feel like we have those human connections with people who we are working and that culture. So I do feel like some companies are beginning to make this a priority, employee mental wellness. They talk about it openly. They're bringing solutions into the workforce that encourage that. All of these things, I think, will help women and people of color more so, right? Like as we talked about, we probably face more stress than anyone else. And so companies acknowledging that wellness holistically and mental wellness is an important initiative, I think is the right thing to do. And I see more and more companies doing that.
So it sounds like flexibility, belonging, and allowing people to show up as their authentic selves are what you're looking forward to.
Yes, absolutely. Great summary.
Padmasree, thank you so much for your time here today, sharing what you've learned and helping us think through some of these questions. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tatum. Hopefully next year we would have made more progress on this.
My name is Jasmine Mithani, and I am the data visuals reporter at the 19th. Today, we're speaking with the Gate Openers, a conversation with a powerful lineup, people who are breaking down gender-based barriers in tech and inspiring others who look like them to join the industry through investment and more. Joining today are Sasha Costanza-Chock, Morgan DeBaun, Arlan Hamilton, and Maya Bhattacharjee-Marcantonio. Sasha Costanza-Chock is a researcher and designer who works to support community-led processes that build shared power, dismantle the matrix of domination, and advance ecological survival. She is currently the head of research and sensemaking at oneproject.org and associate professor at Northeastern University's College of Arts, Media, and Design. Morgan DeBaun is the founder and CEO of Blavity Inc., the leading media company for Black culture and millennials. Under her leadership, Blavity has launched several leading consumer summits, including Summit 21 for Black women creators and AfroTech, the largest tech conference for Black innovators and founders. Arlan Hamilton is a serial entrepreneur, author, and master multitasker. She is the founder and managing director of Backstage Capital, which invests in people of color, women, and LGBTQ+ founders. Since its launch, Backstage has raised nearly $30 billion and invested in 200 startups led by underestimated founders. Maya Bhattacharjee Marcantonio is the co-founder and chief program officer at the Marcy Lab School, a tuition-free, year-long software engineering fellowship that aims to give underestimated youth a path to economic mobility in tech outside the structure of a traditional university education. Before launching the Marcy Lab School, Maya was a middle school teacher and school leader at Leadership Prep Bed-Stuy, also located on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn. Thank you all for joining me here today. Everyone, how do the stories that we tell about technology exclude marginalized groups like queer, trans, and Black and Indigenous people of color?
I'll go. I think, mainstream media is owned primarily by a small group of white men and families. And that means that the power structures and the dynamics of who is deciding what narratives get distributed and who are the storytellers of those narratives is not necessarily reflective of voices that have been traditionally marginalized. So, publications like Why We're All Here, and of course, my own with Blavity and AfroTech and the brands that we've built, have tried to redistribute the narrative and build our own power structures of distributing conversations through the internet where we don't need permissioning from larger mainstream publications or television networks to talk about these things, which has allowed us to apply more pressure, have more dialogue online. And eventually people start to say, well, we can't ignore this forever if all these people are talking about it. So, there are ways to influence those narratives, but it does take a lot of collective work and power.
And I'm thinking a lot about pathways in particular when we think about the institutions that are supporting and feeding the tech sector, the ways in which those institutions are inherently designed to leave others out. Those pathways into technology in and of itself are keeping us in the same loop. And so I'm just really grateful to be in a position of thinking about, like Morgan said, how we're redistributing our inherent beliefs about the people who are worthy of being in those spaces and how we are supporting people and thinking differently about what it means to be in positions of power and those who are worthy of being in positions of power. And in this case, technological or algorithmic power, when building apps or creating solutions for the world, making sure that they're representative of the world that we actually live in.
Sasha, in your book, Design Justice, you write about how many narratives of tech history focus on solitary white genius men, even if that's not the whole truth. What other myths about technology and innovation have perpetuated throughout our society?
So basically all of these counter histories get erased by corporate narratives. So there's the founder myth. There's also the mythology that technology is neutral. It's a very convenient, myth if you're making lots of money from a technology firm. And the other myth that I think is a really important one is the idea that when technology exhibits bias, we just need to make it more inclusive. And a good example of that would be facial recognition technology. So, in a previous role where I was the head of research at the Algorithmic Justice League, which was founded by Dr. Joy Buolamwini. Dr. Buolamwini, together with Timnit Gebru, have this paper called Gender Shades, where they technically demonstrated skin tone disparity in the accuracy of facial recognition technology. So there's a combined skin tone and gender disparity in the accuracy of these systems. Black women, their faces are least likely to be recognized by facial recognition systems, basically. And after they demonstrated this, there was a lot of people saying, oh, well, we just need more data. We just need to make the systems a little bit better. They need to be more inclusive. But the problem is that the ways the technology is then deployed continues to harm people at disparate rates. So if facial recognition technology is being, used on remote proctoring systems like eProctor, and students at home who have darker skin aren't recognized by the system as being looking at the screen the way they're supposed to be, and they're being falsely flagged as cheating on tests that are remote. You know, the way the systems are deployed is often harmful. They're deployed by police forces, they're deployed by immigration forces. So just having more inclusive data sets to make biased technology slightly less biased doesn't necessarily solve the problem of the harms that are being perpetrated.
One question I have is, how have traditional systems failed women and LGBTQ plus people?
Do we have enough time for all of that? I don't know if we have enough time. Just by erasure and underestimating, as we say at Backstage. There's so many ways, let me count them, but in general, it's that underestimation, it's that overlooking. I think of things as small as like traveling for work and going to these hotels and everything being built for men, essentially, because they're the ones who are traveling for business, but that's not the case. So it just kind of reminds me it's reflected in the same way. And that's why we built Backstage to try to counter that.
All of you work with a wide variety of underestimated populations. What are some of the specific supports you give to marginalized genders in your work?
I'll start by saying never enough, but we're so proud of the work that we are doing right now, specifically in identity development within the fabrics of our program, the Marcy Lab School. We are positioning ourselves alongside higher education and rethinking higher education as a real pathway for underestimated young people of color to step in positions of power and wealth. And we spend a lot of time inherently designing a program that is built for gender parity. We've built cohorts of students that are 100% young people of color, 50% who identify as non-male, and we've built a ton of thoughtful programming into our curriculum, including conversations about gender and sexuality and what it looks like to stay whole as we step into positions of power and wealth.
From a company makeup perspective, we do a couple of things. One, as a female leader, we create spaces for other female leaders to continue to grow in non-traditional senses, right? Like if you look at most media or tech companies, you're going to find women in primarily content positions, HR, and we have diversity from top to bottom, people who own P&Ls, who own huge groups of budgets and leadership decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. And I think overall with the work that we do through AfroTech and trying to work with the companies that we advise, whether those are big tech companies or venture-backed startups that are scaling really quickly and want to make the right decisions, part of it is giving them access to talent pools to make it easier for them to defy the odds and not be like their peers. And part of that is making sure that our communities are inclusive. So having conversations, making sure that there's equal amount of coverage, making sure that there are speakers, and representation on stage, and that also that we're not tokenizing anyone's experience.
Everyone, in your experience, what is helpful for women and LGBTQ plus people once they are in the door? What support keeps them in tech?
I think what's really cool, I don't know that everyone is doing this, but I think, from the top down, but I do think that it's very cool, like in tech spaces, that individuals and collaborators can kind of create their own future. That's really the point. That's really what gets people excited about this tech space anyway. And so, yes, you may go into a stodgy kind of company or situation, and you can decide though, do I want to stay here and try to change it from the inside out, try to better it from the inside out? Do I want to leave? These are options. I think I don't really rely on the oppressor or the person who has been set in their ways for decades to to all of a sudden figure out how to manage me or handle me. I instead figure out what can I create within this space, and how can I break the ceiling, break the, get out in the atmosphere here, and change the space. So, I mean, I'm sure there's a list of things that companies can do, but I really think it's the individual's role to make the space hospitable for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's exciting that's happening. I would say, one thing that's going on is there are a lot of important initiatives that are around inclusion, in terms of who gets to be at the table, who gets training and legitimacy and access to networks and access to capital, who gets recognized as creators of technology. And so there are a lot of great, efforts like, Black in AI, or Lesbians Who Tech. So there are a lot of efforts that I think are those more traditional inclusion or DEI efforts. And I don't think those are bad. I think those are important. Those are part of what needs to happen. So yes, we need to find a way to, create a system where more people who traditionally haven't been at the table when it comes time to create new products or ideate or, figure out how we're going to design technologies that can improve all of our lives. Like, yes, that should become a much more inclusive space. So some of those projects are really important and are really good. The challenge is that, just kind of inclusion isn't always the answer, and it's not always enough. So for example, if Google is taking contracts to build a virtual border wall that's going to harm, migrants as they're trying to make their way, across the border, and Google does have a contract like this, then if it's just a sort of, multiracial, multi-gendered group of people who are building this harmful carceral anti-immigrant technology, then that's not an improvement. That's not a good thing, right? So when it comes to that, I think there are a lot of efforts that have made a lot of difference where employees inside these big tech companies have been organizing and saying there are certain things we don't want to build. And also there's certain policies that we don't want to support at our companies. So for example, as Me Too was gaining a lot of steam and visibility, there were a lot of employees at Google who organized to say, hey, there's a kind of a culture of impunity around sexual harassment inside Google. And so you had a massive walkout of thousands of Googlers from, from locations all around the world, to really kind of push the company to change the way that it was handling, sexual harassment claims and whatnot.
When I think about what it looks like to stay in the door once your foot is in the door, like have enough strength to keep walking through that door and walk from the door to the table and pull up a chair behind to that table, like I come back to community as being the thing that we try and wrap our young people walking into software engineering careers around, this idea that they can come back to each other and they can come back to us, they can come back to this extended community of women and marginalized people to support them. And then the other things I would say are just like real tangible skills, like really, really making sure that they feel equipped to be able to take their learnings and apply them to any other challenge that comes their way. And so when we think about like curriculum and what we can be building here, like specifically, like how are we equipping all of our engineers with the tools that will help them not just stay relevant to what's on the market, but will like help them solve any problem that comes across their desk, or know how to handle that like microaggression from a manager and how to like be able to continue to show up. And so I think a combination of like reaching back for the people who got you there and simultaneous with like real training on how to advance in your career is what has supported us so far.
I completely agree with that. I think it's a community to catch you when things get tough. Everyone faces challenges, but there's no doubt that people part of the LGBTQ community experience it more, especially if you are intersectional and you've got so many different things going on. So having people who outside of work, frankly, that are going to be able to help you think through different responses and how you're going to manage it, when to shake it off and when to say, I'm not shaking it off and I'm going to address it. And then internally, I think that looking for mentors, advisors, internal champions who are visible and or are visibly allies. They have made it clear that there's safe spaces for you to have dialogues and conversations. I think that's really helpful. And for those of us who are watching, who are people leaders and are in the power positioning of hiring and promoting, making sure that you're considering having executives with decision-making power outside of HR who are in the business and the technical fields that are making business and operating decisions, who identify and are willing to be a advocate, because you can identify and not want to have the extra burden and extra labor of something else, and that's fine too, right? But there are those who want to be active, and I think that inviting them, acknowledging that and saying, this is a privilege that we as an organization are willing to receive. What can we do to support? And listening to their feedback and ideas.
Maya, your experience as a teacher showed you that traditional systems of higher education were failing students of color. What experiences were you hearing, and what does Marcy do differently?
I think what Marcy does differently is that we're really trying to support our young people with the inherent belief that they are capable of the wild, extraordinary, bold, audacious goal of being able to walk into a six-figure job within 1 year in the tech sector if they're given the support that they deserve. And so what Marcy does differently is I think what's different about our institution as we're building higher education is that every single adult who works in this building fundamentally believes that to be true. And I think that's one thing that we're doing differently. And on the second side is that we've built a curriculum and an experience that is equal parts software engineering, fundamental and technical skills, and just as equal part leadership development, racial identity development, conversations about gender and sexuality, mindfulness, well-being, where our fellows walk into the building every morning and they sit down and they meditate and they write their future state and their affirmations, and they practice gratitude, and then they jump into rigorous study. But they're also reading James Baldwin, and they're also talking about systems of privilege and power, and Beverly Tatum's analogy of the smog, and sharing their mosaics of me, where they're answering the question, who am I, what brought me here, and why am I amazing?
Morgan, you're passionate about mentoring Black small business owners, many of who are women. What common challenges do you hear, and what supports have been the most beneficial while navigating these very white, very cis male spaces?
Yeah, I think for small business owners, there's a number of things. Most small business owners have one employee, which is themselves, and that is not sustainable. Like, it adds so much burnout, and that a lot of people become entrepreneurs because of necessity. They have a desire to solve a problem they believe is not solved. They want to manage their own hours. They want to take care of their family and have flexible work life. People typically become entrepreneurs because something in the system isn't working for them. And then they get into being a small business owner and they realize, oh man, this is tough. And my mental isn't great. And I might be making less money, or it's less consistent. So it's not stable. And I see that a lot with small business owners, especially underrepresented small business owners, women, LGBT, across the gamut. And I think that figuring out how to have financial institutions help create working capital opportunities for small businesses so that they can fill the gap. They have great ideas, they have great operations, but they need a couple of extra months of cash flow so they can make that hire, who will then pay for themselves. It's not easy. You don't walk into a bank and say, I need $25,000. Nobody does that, right? And I remember when I tried to do that, and it was like, I don't know, it was hard, it was confusing. And the financial system thinks that it's easy. For whatever reason, all these banks think that this is easy, and it's not. And this isn't even venture. I'm just talking about, your hairstylist that wants to have her own styling space instead of renting somebody else's chair and spending money every month. So I think access to capital at the banking level and figuring out how they can actually have meaningful programs and federal regulations where they have to have a certain allocation for minority-owned, women-owned, underrepresented businesses is critical. The second thing that I would say briefly is that outside of staffing and working capital is knowledge to actually run the business. There are a million incubators, there are a million, nonprofits that help people and give grants, but who's really teaching someone how to run a P&L? Who's really teaching someone how to use tools like QuickBooks and Salesforce and these tools that these bigger companies are using to help them move faster and not to hire as many people? We don't have that infrastructure in this country for whatever reason. It's very basic how to build a business plan, and that lasts you like 10 seconds in the world. So I'm really committed to helping more corporations build out their own social impact arm to help people adopt their products and make it easier for people to adopt their products at the earlier stage so that they can start to graduate into other products. That's the business case, but also because it gives people access at a cheaper price point.
In general, how do you occupy spaces that are not built for you?
I turn them into spaces that were built for me. So I rarely these days, and it didn't happen overnight. This took me a long time to figure out, but I rarely look at a space and say that it wasn't built for me. We all deserve to be in any room we want to be in. I was recently asked, how do I navigate, for instance, a white space? I don't navigate white space. I don't navigate a male space. I navigate my own space. I create my space, and everyone else can observe and participate if they like. But I'm there for the people who are there for me. And I think that that's something that everyone can apply for themselves, instead of this being a very overwhelming and intimidating space for women in different rooms, claiming it as their own. It's mine now. That's truly, again, it takes time, and there's a process, and it takes repetition, it takes collaboration, and it takes the ability to fail and fall on your feet, fall to your knees. But at the same time, if you can set it up where you're not afraid of those things, little by little, by doing, you can get that strength and stability that you need.
I have had my own journey with figuring out how to navigate the power structures of mostly men, white and Asian men. There's a founder-funder power dynamic where you are the subordinate, you are looking for money, you need their permissioning, you need their approval, you need their checks. And you also have to stand firm in who you are and what you're building and why. And then, the bigger your company gets, the more power you get, then you wind up in boardrooms, right? And I'm in boardrooms a lot with mostly men making $20-30 million a year as corporate executives. And you have to sit there and stand in your power, right? You have to sit there and say, one thing is not like the other. That's me. And therefore, my perspective, it's supposed to be unique. It is different. And that's actually why I'm in this room, is like the thing that makes me unique is the thing that also allows me to provide contribution in a unique way to these people who have said, I actually want to listen and give your perspective. And I think a lot of it is self-work. It has been for me, which is saying, I am here. If I was not supposed to be here, I wouldn't be here. So because I am here, I'm supposed to be here. And so let's walk into this conversation mentally as equals and try to focus on the work. There was a time when I would get just caught up in, what am I wearing? Do I look this way? Should I wear the startup uniform? Do I wear the boy uniform? Do I do this? Do I do that? And it was exhausting, and as I've grown in my own power, I've been able to say, honestly, I'm going to wear whatever I want because I've got a good business and I've got a good team and we solve good problems and we're doing the right thing and we're really good at it. So you don't want to be a part of this, that's on you. You're missing the boat, and caring a little bit less about what everybody thinks.
Yes. To all that Morgan has shared, and similarly, like still on that journey. I there's like so many ways in which I think as a child of immigrants, and my family is from Kolkata in India, and just like grew up across two very different nations and different worlds. Like I, on a regular basis, am like so acutely aware that like I am standing on the shoulders of like my ancestors. I have like so many personal reminders. I have like a doorway to India on my wrist, and lots of just moments of deep like commitment to serve and to stand on the shoulders of like those that came before me. Similar to Morgan, like it is the power dynamics are alive and breathing in every way, shape, and form of every moment and day as a female of color founder, and trying to navigate that. Like the biggest gift for me has actually been in like providing myself with as much spaciousness as I can to feel the weight of all that comes at the amount of assumptions as like a soft-spoken woman that come towards me.
Based on all of your experience, what are some of the key parts of a welcoming tech workspace for marginalized groups, particularly marginalized genders?
Well, I think in the best case, what happens is resources are made available for people in marginalized communities to organize their own spaces or organize our own spaces, you know? So I think, why is it that, you know, there's so much resources very rapidly made available to create a new sort of, co-working spaces or new, startup incubators or spaces like that, without having a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion lens at all. I think it would be great to see more spaces set up that were organized by and for women, BIPOC folks, LGBTQIA plus folks, disabled folks, and people at the intersections. More spaces, and I mean physical spaces like sites, locations are really important. It's important to be able to have a place you can go and have a community of people around you that that you can build community with, as you go on that path of trying to say, oh yeah, let's we'd like to invent a new product or application, or we'd like to explore or even just like kind of learn and hack together. And there is a tradition of that. There's a whole wave of feminist maker spaces, of Black and Latinx owned spaces, like physical locations. There's a couple in the Bay, there's a couple in New York, there's a couple in different cities have organized these types of spaces. But I think we need to see a lot more of that. We need to see a lot more resources put into saying, hey, instead of always privileging the same group of people, when we think about what it's going to take to get folks together, to invent new technologies and products and services, what would happen if we rerouted some of that capital to communities that may have a ton of really great solutions and ideas and capacities, but just aren't getting the resources, to kind of to realize them as much.
Well, we're constantly telling people that they should show up as themselves to work. That's like the last few years. And we mean that and it's earnest. But some people are afraid to show up as themselves because they don't have that welcoming environment. So I think giving the mic to the employee, I think not assuming the employer knows exactly what the underrepresented person or groups need within their company. For instance, there'll be a lot of programming, especially after 2020. There's a lot of programming, a lot of onboarding of new talent, et cetera. And they think that one happy hour or one event that's, going to the movie theater to see a black, quote unquote, black film or something of that sort, or a film for women is enough because they decided that that was what was right for them. So I think having people in charge of their destiny, giving them the tools and resources so that they can then act on those ideas that they have has to come from the top and be well supported. So the companies and the firms that I've seen do the best at this, really the CEO kind of gives that support, but also gets out the way.
Arlan, what would be one thing you could change that would make the most difference in creating opportunities for underrepresented people?
I think more people in power need to give up something. I think that there are a lot of people who give lip service and who actually really believe that they are allies, and in a lot of ways they are, of course. They're not the enemy. But I think that there are some, I'm not so much, again, interested in trying to change the hearts and minds of the oppressor, the person who is just far gone, right? I'm not really interested in that. I'm actually thinking about the people who already want to help, but they're not helping enough. Like, I can always do more. I know I can do more than I'm doing today. And therefore other people who care can do more. So I've said multiple times that I'd rather see 1,000 millionaires than 1 billionaire. And if I earn $1 billion, you won't ever see me keeping $1 billion, right? And you can put that on the record. Like, I will never have $1 billion for a long period of time. It will always be dispersed. And so people with power and with influence and with capital need to learn to share and really give up what is actually just fleeting to begin with. We're all going to die. You cannot take it with you. And so if you have a lot of power and you're willing to give 1% away so that you can help somebody, great. Give 10%, 20, 50%, 80% away. Sacrifice. That's what I think has to change. And if that doesn't change, then we really don't have real change.
How do you all personally strike the balance between intervening in systems that are not made for people like us to succeed and imagining something completely new?
Not everybody has to come in with a hammer and break things, right? We don't all have to do that. And some of it is most of it is a process over a long time. I've been working at Backstage for 12 years, really, even though we've been officially a company for 7.5 years. It's little by little. So it's about just sort of envisioning the world you want to see, and then understanding what you have to do with the power you have today to get there. So you map this out, and so they work in tandem. What is true today and what could be true work in tandem, and you're walking towards each other is really how I imagine it. I mean, I physically envision it.
Well, I think that both are really important, and it's kind of like what role do you want to play as a person? We constantly need to, stop the harms of old harmful systems, while we also need to make space and hold space and create space to envision the more liberatory and beautiful possible futures that we know we need to build. One of my favorite projects right now is very much in the kind of speculative futuring space. I co-created together with Joana Varón, who's the director of Coding Rights, which is a Brazilian hacker feminist organization, and Clarote, who's an illustrator from Berlin. We created this project called the Oracle for Transfeminist Technologies, and it's basically a card deck, like a tarot deck, which provides you with a series of prompts around values and everyday objects and particular types of situations and communities dealing with those situations. And you basically receive these cards, and then there's a series of prompts that help you create a blueprint for a far future technology that embeds transfeminist values in everyday objects. And then people come up with these really fantastic ideas for quite radical and fun, new future technologies. And the prompts are designed around having them come up with stuff that's 500 years in the future. But the truth is, a lot of the things that people create, we could start building them now. So I really, love that project.
As everyone knows, being a marginalized person in technology can be exhausting. How do you balance mentorship and visibility with self-care?
Oh, such a tough question. I say no to a lot of things, and I selectively say yes to the things that I think will drive the most impact. So I'm more inclined to say no to a DM or a LinkedIn request for a pick your brain session, because I find that the amount of impact that I can have in that 30 minutes is trivial to me, maybe significant to that one individual, but small to me. I would say yes to things like this because I know it's 30 minutes too many, right? And that is meaningful to me. And I also try to serve people who otherwise wouldn't have access to these conversations. And then lastly, as it relates to my stability, I ebb and flow. I go through weeks of, I don't want to do anything. Don't ask me to do anything outside of my executive job as chairman and CEO. I don't have the time because I want to go spend time in my garden and it's spring. And then I have it's season. I need to be out there. It is a part of my responsibility to be visible. And I just let myself have that ebb and flow. I don't expect it to be constant. And I communicate with my team. I communicate with my co-founders. I communicate with my board. I communicate with my family, and everybody knows, is she on or is she off right now? And they protect me. I feel protected and cherished by the people that are really close in my life. And I think it's partially because I try to cherish myself. And so they respect that.
I'm really good at boundaries these days. Really good at it. I guess it's just getting older, and then seeing so much. So I personally give a lot out to the world each day, by choice, but I think I give a lot in a way that's kind of specific. And so it is a lot. But I do that in sprints. So I can have high impact to thousands and thousands of people if I want to in a day, or high impact to one person and help change their life if I want to, right? But then I know that if I don't stop to take care of myself, I don't stop to do the kind of dorky things that make me happy, that I won't be able to do that again or for too long. And that's really important to me. I think of us as like we're like stars, and we do have this shelf life, right? We do, and if you burn bright for too long, it's a shorter life. So what I do like to burn bright in sprints if I can.
Yeah, I do a lot of talks, and the book Design Justice has been pretty successful, and the book starts, there's an introduction, the book where I talk about being a trans person going through airport security systems and the millimeter wave scanners, and the way that they are binary gendered, where the TSA agent kind of looks at you visually and decides if they think you're a boy or a girl, and they press a blue boy button or pink girl button, and then depending on what they do, your body shape, the scan of your body is compared to a normative body shape in the database, and then you get flagged as risky. And if many trans people constantly get flagged because our bodies don't conform to the binary constructs in the database, and many other many disabled people constantly get flagged if they have prostheses or non-normative bodies. Black women often get flagged because of their hair, and so on and so forth. So basically anybody that doesn't fit the data set that the tool was trained on is likely to be flagged as risky. So I share that story a lot, and I think that you're right. It's it can be emotionally draining to constantly kind of like be out there, using personal lived experience harm, whether that's like small or great, you know, to make a point about how technology operates and to get people, you know, thinking in a different way. So I think the way that I approach it is I feel like it does also bring me energy though. It does give me like power because a lot of people resonate with the story. And so I feel like it's also about building community. Um, so I think one thing that is really important is just constantly building community and connecting with other folks who are marginalized in hegemonic tech spaces and saying, yeah, like I see you, like this is what's happening to me, this is what's happening to you. Let's figure out how we can organize together to shift this. Like that's helpful. Um, and then also just very, you know, basic stuff. Like I've definitely like reduced the frequency of talks that I'm doing. That's been really important. Just at some point learning how to say no. So saying, you know, I can't do that, you know, at this time, and being okay with that, I think is important. But mostly I think, yeah, just having really like constantly building community, and then having a really loving and wonderful partner helps a lot. And I'm parenting, so that comes with both stresses but also a lot of joys. And so being kind of like in that role um, is something that I can just kind of turn off the things that I'm doing in public, and just focus on my chosen family and community and on my kids.
Yeah, it is a learning curve in real time. As always a teacher, always a learner. And I think that um, the self-care is something that I'm learning in real time, like really starts and ends with um, our students. Um, I'm like most energized knowing um, that these like incredible young people are on a path of healing and financial freedom and liberation that rests on my ability to heal, my ability to create spaces that liberate my ability to liberate myself. And so a lot of like my self-care work is really built in like what does it look like for me to heal from being a marginalized person, stepping in and working within systems of privilege and power. um Similar to Morgan, like for me it starts with like stillness. I'm still learning. I think Morgan is more ahead of me of like what it looks like to say no to some things in service of myself or in service of like a long-term vision. Right now I'm like really grounded by my own community of women of color outside of work, who just know me as Maya, not Maya, the co-founder, not Maya, the chief program officer, like simply just Maya. I spend a lot of time like writing, breathing, processing, and building strength to continue to create a system that is unlike one that exists out there. And then, yeah, just like a lot of failure in the self-care space, honestly. I'm learning right now at the young age of 33, like just how much my ability to do this work sits on my ability to create space for myself to just like breathe and exist and live. And that is a question that I'm currently answering, but I'm getting, I think, better at day to day with small practices, like morning meditations, long walks, listening to music and walking around the city that makes me feel so small, and coming back to my community in Harlem, the people that raised me in India, and reminding myself that like all of these walls that I'm hitting, if turned on their side, become bridges. And if I can have enough strength to meet that wall, then I have the capacity to turn it into a bridge for all the other people that I'm trying to help get across it.
Finally, what are you most hopeful about for the future?
I think that what keeps me optimistic and hopeful is definitely just kind of watching new generations take up and push forward the level of analysis and critique, but also vision and desire to build something different. I really, maybe that's a cliche, but I think that the next generations are doing pretty amazing stuff, and I'm excited to see, what's going to happen and where they're going to take it.
I'm kind of a realist, so I'm not really hopeful that things are going to just turn around. Everybody's going to figure it out all of a sudden. But I do really enjoy the thought of the individual. The individual can do so much. I may never know their name. I won't know most of their names. They may never know mine. But each day we can add to the positive. We can add to forward momentum. And we can just grab a bit of joy for ourselves each day. And so that keeps me going. It's really, really tough with everything that goes on a daily basis, that we with technology see more and more of in real time. I think that's something that none of our ancestors ever had to experience, although we of course have not experienced a lot of the terrible things that our ancestors, all of us, have experienced. But I look for, I just kind of look for the good in people that I know exists, and that individual determination for their own brighter day collectively. I look forward to that.
I think the kids are all right. I recently did do a one-on-one call with a young woman who's going to Rutgers in the fall. And she had a little anxiety of, what am I going to do? What am I going to major in? I need an internship. And I'm like, sis, you are fine. You are light years ahead of the rest of us. She's already volunteered at her mosque and done all these really incredible things at 18. And I am just so grateful and energized that this next generation has picked up the baton aggressively, and they are not slowing down, and they're defying so many social constructs. Us as the adults in the room are going to have to rethink these systems. We have to, because they're going to break it anyways. So they either break it and we fix it, or we set it up so they don't break it. And I'm really excited and very grateful that they've, for whatever reason, have become this ambitious and resilient and such an advocate for the people.
All of the beauty and the brilliance walking full speed into the tech sector. Our young people are sitting in a room right now having a deep discussion about what it looks like to create healthier online places. And across from them, Cielo, one of our alumni who graduated 3 years ago, just showed me a picture of the home that she bought for her family in Queens, and the way she spent her morning was sitting on the porch of that home as a 23-year-old without a college degree. I'm just so excited for these young folks to walk into financial freedom, but also for all of the ideas that they're bringing into these companies, the changing of the tides, the different conversations that they're having with their teams simply because of their lived experiences, and the ideas that they have to use technology to solve real social justice issues in our world.
Sasha, Morgan, Arlan, Maya, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mel Ma, and I'm going to be leading you through a meditation to tap into our intuition. So intuition is something that we need to use for everything, really, in our work, in our personal relationships. It's essentially the foundation for intentional decision making. So especially if you find yourself in a conflict or you feel misaligned or resistant towards something, it's important to slow down, turn inward, and connect to your intuition. We all have one. Some of ours are just stronger than others, but it's just like any other muscle in the body. It's about training it to strengthen it. So let's do a little exercise, a little meditation to strengthen it today. Close your eyes, please, and make sure your spine is nice and straight. Have your hands resting down on your legs. And just feel the whole body melt into this position. Let your body soften into the present. Now do your best to remain still for this entire meditation, tuning out any distractions or any temptation to move or fidget. Now let's land here with a deep breath in through the nose and exhale through the mouth. Now we'll shape the breath to create a little more focus and presence in the mind. We'll breathe in 4 and breathe out 6. So again, just take a full breath in, no counts. Exhale, let it go. Breathe in here for 4, 2, 3, 4. Out 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In 4. Exhale 6. Two more. In 4. Exhale 6. Observe how the mind slows down with the breath. One more round on your own. In 4, out 6. This breath work helps us create a bit more concentration as we focus on one single thing, the breath. When you're finished that round, return to a natural and even breath, in and out through your nose. Now take a slow breath in. Exhale, release it. Please bring your left hand onto your chest, right hand onto your belly, and bow the chin forward, honoring the intuition, our inner compass, and recognizing that all the answers we seek on the outside actually exist within. When you're ready, you may lower your hands and slowly open your eyes. Welcome back. I hope that short little meditation brought a little bit of presence and maybe some clarity in the mind. That intuition is that feeling of clarity, that feeling of, yes, this is right for me. This decision feels aligned with my purpose and who I am. And so see if you can make it a practice to listen to your intuition more strongly in even the smallest moments. I once had a coach tell me to spend 5 seconds on every decision, even at a restaurant when you're trying to decide what to eat. You deep down have a gut instinct and know what you want in each moment. It's just about getting present and still enough to listen to it. Thank you guys all so much for your attention. Have a lovely day.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining the 19th Represents Annual Summit. My name is Grace Panetta. I'm a politics reporter here at the 19th, and I'm honored to be hosting today's tech one-on-one conversation with Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter of the Federal Trade Commission, the agency charged with ensuring privacy, consumer protection, and enforcing the nation's antitrust laws. Thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight to be here.
We're delighted to have you too. So to begin, the FTC touches a lot of areas of American life as consumers, as users of the internet that we may not think about all the time. How would you kind of describe what the FTC does in your role as a regulator and public servant?
Sure. So the FTC has an incredibly important mission that affects almost every American's day-to-day life, really every American's day-to-day life, and very few people always know about it on a day-to-day basis. But we have two main missions, protecting consumers and promoting competition. That means we enforce the nation's antitrust laws, and we also enforce the FTC Act's prohibition on unfair and deceptive acts and practices and unfair methods of competition. Mostly, this means we work hard every day to try to keep people safe from unfair business practices that inhibit their privacy, their economic mobility, and their ability to participate fully in society.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you for that primer. And I want to start with digital privacy, which is a big topic we're discussing today and a big topic of discussion nationally, and especially as it relates to health data and for women. Women make up the majority of health decisions for their families and are most often in this space. I know the FTC has recently entered into settlements with health startups GoodRx and BetterHelp. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what you're seeing and doing in the health privacy space as it relates to data on the internet.
Sure, this is an incredibly important issue for all Americans, but as you know, especially for women, and especially after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, where reproductive health care is an extremely sensitive topic and really at risk in a lot of areas in the United States. So health data has long been understood to be among the most sensitive types of data about people. It's not just reproductive health care. It's, are you getting mental health treatment? Are you getting substance abuse counseling? Are you going to a cancer treatment center? These are things that are deeply personal, deeply private, and incredibly important to people. So exactly as you reflect, we've been working really hard in this area to make sure that people's sensitive health data is treated with the sensitivity and protections that the law requires. So a couple of things that we have done in this space. We sued Kachava, a data broker, alleging that they made it possible to track the precise geolocation of people based on their mobile devices. And these locations could include places of worship or addiction treatment facilities or healthcare facilities, including reproductive healthcare facilities. That, for the record, was a bipartisan complaint because across the board, people have, and regulators, members of Congress have concerns about the sensitivity of people's personal location data. So that's one thing. We're looking at data tracking. Another thing you mentioned, we've sued a couple companies effectively for collecting sensitive health data, telling people that they were going to keep it private and then selling it for advertising purposes. This is something that we are concerned about across the board, you know, the collection of data for one purpose and the use of it for another purpose, but it's particularly sensitive when it comes to health data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, you know, you touched on reproductive rights specifically. I wanted to drill down on that because I remember in the chaotic days and weeks after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, there being a lot of concern and a lot of articles about, you know, should you use a cycle tracking app? Should you be searching for things on Google? How have you seen the landscape around that specifically evolve since the Dobbs decision? And what would you tell women right now who are concerned about their digital activity and whether or not it could, you know, implicate them in a state where abortion is banned, for example?
Well, I think across the board, people need to be very careful and sensitive about their own digital hygiene. We have lots of guidance on the FTC website about steps people can take to keep themselves safe. And, you know, in my own life, I try hard to read privacy policies carefully, follow what companies are promising that they're going to do with their data, figure out what that actually means, and make informed choices. But I think it is really, really important that the burden not be entirely on individual people to manage the entire black box ecosystem of data. That's one of the things we're looking at very closely. You know, I think that the notice and consent model under which data has historically been treated is pretty universally understood to be broken. Notice and consent makes a lot of sense if you have meaningful notice and an actual opportunity to decide. In today's data economy, we don't have either of those for the most part. You know, the way I think about it is I am a lawyer. I am extremely well educated. I have some professional expertise in the field of privacy, and I cannot understand what privacies or policies are telling me most of the time. And if I can't understand it, and I am the best suited user to be able to understand it, most people don't have a prayer. And even if I could understand it, most times, many apps sort of give you a binary choice: consent to collection and use the app, or don't consent and don't use it, or consent to collection and use my website, or don't consent and don't use it. And that's not meaningful choice. So I think we need to be really mindful that this framework that seems admirable actually is not fit for today's economy and today's technological landscape.
That's really interesting. So you're basically, you read the fine print, but a lot of the times it might not even make all that much sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm saying is it's great to do what you can to take care of your own data hygiene and be sensitive to the ways information about you is being collected and used. And I want everybody to do that. But from an enforcement perspective, we're also thinking very, very hard about making sure that companies are held to the higher standard that the law requires of not tricking people into how they give up their data and not using it for unfair purposes, even if they consent to it. I will put in a plug at this point. I just finished Danielle Citron's excellent book, The Fight for Privacy, and I know you're going to hear from her a little bit later, but she has an excellent guide at the end of that to the ways people can take more agency over their data. And at the same time, talks about a lot of the problems with the entire burden being on individuals to make those choices.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. And that'll be a great conversation with her later. Another area of digital privacy that a lot of people are thinking about right now is privacy and collection as it relates to children and kids on the internet. Gen Z, the first generation to grow up online, Gen Alpha, even more so. It's something we've seen a lot of policy making on at the state and federal level. And I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts on some of the efforts by lawmakers to address this so far. What do you think of the way that states have gone about it? And by the way, some federal lawmakers and Congress have tried to introduce bills, for example, limiting what age kids can go on the internet, trying to enforce things like age verification, and even trying to ban social media companies from using algorithms to show kids under 18 content. Is that an effective way of addressing those concerns?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me start with the general concept of kids. The law has, for several decades now, reflected that kids are particularly sensitive population and their data needs to be treated with sensitivity. The big federal privacy law that the US has at this point, until we get a comprehensive national privacy law, which I really hope we do, is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And that is that was a groundbreaking law at the time it was introduced and has provided some really important changes, but it also relies primarily, although not exclusively, on the notice and consent model. It's a put parents in the driver's seat idea. And as a parent, I think about this the same way I do thinking about myself as a user. I have 4 little kids. And as I mentioned, I am a something of a privacy expert, very well educated. I'm also a pretty hands-on parent. I'm really engaged with my children. I cannot be in the driver's seat of all of their interactions with technology. And this was true before the pandemic, and they went into Zoom school, and even now, as they've come out and they're back in in-person school, but using different kinds of tech platforms all day, every day. Even if I didn't have a job, really, even if I only had 1 kid, it would be a full-time job to manage that kid's interactions with technology, and it's just not possible. And I think lawmakers have recognized this, and there are proposals to update COPPA. As you reflected, there have also been a lot of movements in the states about kid-specific legislation. I will tell you, I think, just my personal opinion, is that among the more promising of those are the sort of design code models that require companies to think about the interests of a child when they are doing design. I worry a little bit right now about models that rely on age verification, because I think there is, at least so far in how the technology has developed, a real tension between the desire to age gate something in order to protect children's privacy and the necessity to collect a lot of really personal information about people in order to do that age gating. So I think that's a real challenge. And so I have some skepticism about that area. I also think kids are not monolithic. You know, my 8-year-old is much more online, you know, like of that universe than my 10-year-old, who is really much happier playing basketball. So, you know, kids are different. And I think we have to be sensitive to that. But I'm encouraged by all the attention that's being paid in legislatures across the country and in Congress to the issue of kids specifically. And it's something we're focusing on at the FTC too.
Yeah, and how do you think the tech platforms are doing on this front? Because it seems like almost all the advertising I see from Meta and from TikTok is, you know, touting all these tools they have for families and how they're trying to keep kids safe, which I think is very telling that they're expending a lot of resources marketing on that. But how are they doing in practice?
I'm glad it's something that they want to market on. I think that the data about kids' interactions with tech platforms on everything from privacy and safety to the really very serious mental health concerns, especially for teens, suggests there's a lot of work left to do. I have huge anxiety about this as a parent and as a law enforcer. I think that there is a lot of room for improvement. And I think that the more evidence that comes out, the more concerned we should be.
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting arena to watch going forward. I want to move now to some other consumer protection related topics. It was really interesting. I was listening to an interview that the FTC's chair, Lena Khan, did on NPR's Marketplace recently, where she mentioned some of the shortages of things like formula that a lot of women and families have been experiencing over the past year. And that was not something I initially connected to the FTC. So I was really interested to hear her talk about that. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to how your work on competition, antitrust issues affect some of these everyday shortages of goods that consumers have been experiencing.
Yeah, I think this is such an important point. So it's a question of both shortages. I think it's a question of access in terms of both shortages and prices. One of the things that is true across the board is that when markets are more concentrated, the market players can raise prices, which can inhibit access, especially for lower income people. And when it's a necessary good, like formula or groceries or healthcare, that's critically important. Another area is when we look at supply chain shocks in a concentrated market. If there is only 1 or 2 players and something goes wrong at one of them, then there is no backfill into that market. And so you see things like we saw with the formula shortage, which is life-threatening for babies, devastating and terrifying for their families. So having competitively healthy, vibrant markets is not just about esoteric antitrust terms like hypothetical monopolist tests. It's about the day-to-day experience and opportunity of people to participate in the economy, make meaningful choices, and access goods and services that are innovative, competitively priced, and available.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And another area sort of related to this, but more about the labor market, is we've seen a lot of recent waves of layoffs across multiple industries, some higher profile things that have happened in the media industry that have highlighted the ubiquity of non-compete agreements, which I know the FTC is trying to prohibit. How do non-competes affect the labor market, and specifically women workers and workers of color who may be already at a disadvantage?
This is a great one. And this is another one of those areas where at the beginning I referenced the fact that our work can touch everybody's day-to-day lives, but in ways they may not know is happening in the background. Non-competes, by their very definition, raise questions from a competition standpoint. They are a requirement not to compete. In competition law, we usually want people competing. What it specifically refers to is a restriction employers put into employment contracts that say workers cannot leave their job and go work for someone in the same field in within a certain geographic radius or for a certain amount of time. In practice, this can mean that if you are stuck in a job that is not treating you well, either not paying you what you deserve, which we know happens to women all the time, where workplaces might be abusive, which unfortunately we also know happens to women all the time. People can be trapped in those jobs and not able to go seek other employment. And that is really devastating. It's economically devastating. It's also psychologically devastating and emotionally devastating. And the data that is in the FTC's notice of proposed rulemaking on this topic reflects that this happens not just to high-level executives, and honestly, not just to lower level hourly wage workers, but to everyone in between, from hairdressers to, you know, my kid's karate studio teacher was bound by a non-compete that required him to stop working for a couple of years after he left the current studio. It's across the board, and that is something that is really concerning. So we have, as you suggested, proposed a rule. We will study the record very carefully and with an open mind and figure out whether it supports finalizing a rule or making any modifications to a final rule. But I think the question of non-competes is a really important one for people to be aware of. And I'm hopeful that the public dialogue that has started about it in the wake of our proposal will also help more companies attract talent by saying, we won't bind you with a non-compete. We will pay you what you deserve. We will give you the benefits that you need. And that's how we will attract better and better talent.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting arena. And what are kind of some other ways that the FTC is thinking about some of these labor fairness and worker protection issues as it relates to boosting competition and antitrust even?
So antitrust law has always been able to take account of labor issues. We talk a lot about monopoly, and most people know that the term monopoly means you have a single seller who can control the price and raise it really high. There's a parallel term, monopsony, and that means you have a single buyer who can depress input prices and control the input market. Those sound like fancy antitrust terms, but if you think about it like this, if there's only one employer in your town, that employer has an enormous amount of power over who they hire, how much they pay, and there isn't fair competition for labor, which tends to be an input into markets. So we have looked at input markets on other sort of materials that go into competition, whether it's, you know, the price of supplies, but labor is one of those things. So we are looking at input markets, including labor, in a lot of our merger investigations these days. And we had a hospital merger challenge last year where Chair Khan and I wrote that we would have included the challenge, the merger on a labor basis. We also are looking at labor from the perspective of the gig worker economy, or the fissured workplace. And this, I think, is an area that's especially important for women too, because women often need more flexible hours to accommodate childcare or other caregiving responsibilities. And that's great. We want people to have flexibility in the workplace, but flexibility does not mean exploitation. And we need to ensure that companies are treating all of their employees fairly, whether they are fissured employees or traditional employees. And so we had one case where we challenged Amazon Flex for lying to its drivers, who were gig workers, about how much money they would get in tips, basically for withholding the tips of the promised tips of its drivers. And we were able to return money to drivers for that. And we did another policy statement on gig workers that talked about the ways in which we're going to try to make sure that they are treated fairly in the workplace, even if they are not classified by their employers as traditional employees.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think that connection between these big concepts that might seem kind of inaccessible in everyday labor markets is so important. One thing we haven't talked about yet that is a big thing in the tech world right now is AI, artificial intelligence. We could probably spend a whole day of this summit talking about it. But I'm just curious to kind of get your thoughts on the intersection of AI and some of the privacy and consumer protection issues we've been talking about. What are kind of the opportunities and challenges that you see as a regulator in this very fast evolving space?
Yeah, this is, you're right, could be the topic of a very long conversation, but I will try to distill it down to a few key points. I wrote a law review article a couple years ago about this, about algorithmic decision making and economic justice. And I think the point that I made there, that my colleague Commissioner Bedoya has made recently, that Chair Khan has made recently, is that these are new technological tools, but the rules still apply to them. And we look at them through the lens of the FTC Act, the same way we look at other conduct. And so the things that jump out at me as particular sources of concern are misrepresentations about what tech can do. You know, a promise that your AI can solve all the problems or discern somebody's personality from a picture. And those are marketing claims that we would investigate and challenge the same way we challenge other marketing claims about what your health supplement could do if it's not backed up by reliable scientific evidence. So that's one area. I think an even bigger area of concern is the way AI can perpetuate and exacerbate disparate outcomes for people. So, you know, everybody, I think at this point knows the example of the hiring algorithm that was trained on a dominantly male, on a company's current pool of employees, which was predominantly male, and went on to suggest only male candidates because it was replicating the discrimination that was baked into the data set. And women, I think in particular, can be made invisible in input data sets, and that problem can be duplicated, exacerbated in the output set. And I think this is where intersectionality becomes particularly important, because women are made invisible, people of color are made invisible, women of color sort of get the double burden there. And I think we can't lose sight of those really troubling lenses that are applied. And then I also think we have to think really seriously about the role of AI and competition and the ways in which broad data inputs can exacerbate some of the anti-competitive dynamics in tech markets already. So those are three buckets, probably not the entirety of the universe, but just some of the things we'll look at. It may be that these tools require new specific laws and rules. And I am very, very open to all of the different legislative efforts to address them. But in the meantime, you know, the way I think about our job is we have to do the best we can with the laws we have right now, you know, even if we think it would be better to have different laws. So we are trying to use the entirety of our toolbox. And one thing that we have not mentioned so far today, last summer, we opened an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on data security and commercial surveillance. And that record asked a lot of questions about some of these issues that we're talking about today, including AI. And so we are currently reviewing that record and hope to come to next steps sometime this year so that we can move forward, if the record supports it, proposing any specific rules that might address some of these issues.
That is all really, really fascinating. And that segues into the last topic I want to touch on today, which is your relationship with the Hill, the policymaking process. Right now, Congress is divided, but there are a lot of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who feel very strongly about all of these topics we've been talking about, whether it's tech regulation, privacy, competition. How are you, navigating things with the Hill? And do you expect any major bipartisan tech or antitrust policy bills to come out of Congress in the near future?
So I worked in Congress for a decade before I came to the FTC. And what I learned there is should never bet money on expecting Congress to do or not do any particular thing. So I try to be out of the prediction game. But what I do know is that the necessary ingredients for moving forward on some of these important issues are there. There's bipartisan concern about the power of tech platforms. There's bipartisan concern about the mental health challenges kids and teens are facing in the online world these days. There is bipartisan concern about the market power of large companies across the board. And so these are all avenues where I think there is the sort of necessary ingredients to get to some kind of compromise. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, did one of the most important things for us last year, which is not glamorous from a legislative perspective, but they gave us a little bit more money. And that makes a huge difference. The FTC has been systematically underfunded for decades. And in fact, we currently have, at the beginning of the Reagan administration, we had about 50% more employees than we do today. So if you think about the scope of the questions that we have to grapple with, the way the economy has changed since 1981, and the fact that we're doing it with 2/3 the number of people that we had then, that is a real challenge. So the funding boost, again, which was passed in the bipartisan omnibus appropriations bill, made a huge, huge difference. And hopefully Congress will continue to build on that down payment and help us have the appropriate tools to tackle the very real and rapidly changing problems in today's economy.
Yeah, and just quickly, I mean, what are you also seeing in the states? Are there any interesting state level policies you think have been particularly impactful, ones that maybe Congress could go off of?
Tons. Well, I mean, California has been a huge leader in the privacy space and the tech policy space, and I think that work has been enormously important. And California is not the only state that's grappling with these issues. I think there are 6 different states that have now passed data privacy laws. That is great and important innovation in the absence of congressional action. Illinois has a biometric data law that I think is really important when it comes to people's most sensitive personal data. And I think, you get to see some of the benefits of the laboratories of democracies that work in this space. That said, I worry about a universe where Californians have protections that Minnesotans don't. And from a federal perspective, I would really love to see a federal floor for some of these protections. If states are doing something effective, let's build off of it. I also think we can take important lessons from our colleagues overseas in the UK and in Europe. They are grappling with digital market power and digital privacy issues directly and aggressively. Some of the laws that they pass, I think, have real value. Some of them are ones where we can learn lessons about what works well and what doesn't. GDPR, I think, has really important provisions and protections for how data is handled. I also think we all hate the cookie pop-ups that started appearing after GDPR went into effect. And to me, that's a great example of a well-intentioned provision that doesn't work as it was intended. I don't think it's giving people real meaningful choice about cookie acceptance, and it is creating just sort of like extra friction. And that's okay. That's always what happens when we work on new policy. And so our job is to iterate, is to look at what works and to build on that. And that's what I think about the FTC's work generally. The agency has an incredible tradition of self-critical examination. We look at what we've been doing and we try to improve and we try to learn from it. And we're at a moment where we have a real opportunity to learn from and build and grow from the last couple decades of how we've approached enforcement. And what we're trying to do right now is really dig into our toolbox, make sure we're using all of our tools as effectively as possible and reaching all Americans in our enforcement efforts and not letting any group be left out or left behind from the protections of the law.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. That is unfortunately all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner Slaughter. This has just been fascinating.
Thank you so much, Grace. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I'm now thrilled to hand things off to Natasha Tiku. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Tiku, tech culture reporter for the Washington Post. We're going to be talking about what's at stake as big tech impacts society at large. We're joined by Frances Haugen, Facebook whistleblower and founder of Beyond the Screen, and Tracy Chu, founder and CEO of Block Party, an organization that builds tools for online safety and anti-harassment. Later, we'll be joined by Daniel Citron. Tracy and Frances, thank you for joining us. I'd like to start just by asking you both about your individual priorities in terms of tech's impact on society, civic life, our personal lives. Is there a particular issue right now that's really important to you or that you want to highlight?
I can go first. So with Block Party, we are trying to build tools for online safety, and that is top of mind for me, making it so that people can be online and participate in digital spaces and feel comfortable and in control of their experience and able to partake in all the good that is possible from being online. I know sometimes we get lost in the conversations just talking about all the harms and how terrible things are, but there is actually a lot of really good stuff online, and we want to bring back that magic of what is possible when a lot of people are connected online, the democratization of information and access and connection, like all that good stuff. And part of making that possible for people to access is the online safety component.
I would say my biggest priority is quite similar to when I first came out as a whistleblower, which is I really believe in the democratic process. And that doesn't mean, the government coming in and saying, you can say this, you can't say this. It's more about the question of, we deserve to have a say in how these systems are built and governed. And we've basically come to accept over time that because they're free products, we should just feel grateful that, we get to access them, that we don't have to pay for them. When we should be saying, hey, we live more and more of our lives in these digital spaces. We would never consider not having a town council. We would never not consider having a school board because we like to have influence on things that directly impact our lives. And so this question of, what information does the public need in order to do the rituals of democratic governance? What level of transparency needs to be mandated of platforms so that we can take actions? Maybe that's an advertiser boycott. Maybe that's a usage boycott. Maybe that's divestment. Maybe that's just, people actually sitting and protesting these companies. What would it take for us to have a similar level of transparency to what we have with, say, automobiles? Because I think there's a lot of potential for us to unlock the different mechanisms within the ecosystem of accountability if you actually can get over that hill of opacity.
And, you both have been really active in advocating for consumers, for protecting consumers. But I think, we're seeing with the gold rush around generative AI, right? Some of the same harms and patterns repeat themselves with emerging technology. And we're seeing regulators kind of take a wait and see approach a little bit. And really the only thing then that stands between the consumers and potential risks are the policies of the companies. I'm just wondering, what you both think. Are there ways that we can protect ourselves as consumers? Like how would you try to get involved, I guess, or how do you wish that this new generation of tech was unfolding a little differently?
One of the conversations I wish we had around generative AI is about, what are the tools that are available to us to put pressure on these systems to move in the right direction. People have advocated for things like a pause, and that usually makes like my blood run a little hot because we're dealing with technologies that have a very, very low barrier to entry and are extremely have extremely high potential in at least the short run, but at the risk of extremely high long-term, say, existential risk. One of the things that I wish more people would come in and do is say things like, the Fortune 500 should get together and say, hey, we will only buy generative AI products that follow the following safety protocols. There are ways of creating market incentives where we say, hey, you can go off and do crazy research and potentially be quite dangerous, but we're not going to make large amounts of capital available to you to do this. And it feels a little bit like we're still searching for, we've kind of fallen in a rut when it comes to how we regulate technology over the last 20 years, where if it's an issue beyond, if it's a lever beyond privacy, antitrust, and God, what's the third one? There's a third one. There's like a very limited toolkit that we've used. And I think coming in and trying to think about this a little more creatively and saying, let's actually think about incentives. Like let's figure out how to make incentives for people to do good things, not just incentives to keep people from doing bad things.
One thing I wish we had more in the conversation is an explicit discussion of what are the values and trade-offs I think we often talk about like, oh, there's this harm. Like, okay, sure, but like there's also sometimes a trade-off of harms. For example, in the space that I know well, like with harassment, sometimes you have tools that protect against harassment, but the cost of potentially increasing misinformation. And just having very explicit discussions around what are the things that we value? Do we want more data privacy, or do we want usability and user convenience? Making it super explicit in the discussions with consumers as well as with legislators makes, I think, all those conversations just more productive in media, as opposed to talking in the ideal sense of like protect against harm. So of course, nobody's going to say like we shouldn't protect against harms, but when we get into the specifics of like, what does that mean? Like, what are we going to trade off? I think the privacy example is one that is very salient. It's very easy to say users should have more privacy, but users also want usability, and like they want to be able to use things without thinking about having to enter all their information all the time. And so being more explicit in discussing what these trade-offs are, I think would help all of us in understanding like how can we actually try to resolve some of these tensions? How do we move forward productively, whether it's with tech company policies or with legislation?
I wanted to build on that question around values, right? That when we, right now, kind of our primary framing for how are we going to get safety off of these systems is we have teams that are known as alignment organizations within these AI companies that try to align it with our values. And one of the things that I think people should really be talking about quite openly is that every one of these generative AIs that's out there right now has a bunch of baked in values, but we don't get to see what they are. You know, we can kind of intuit what they are by penetration testing them, by throwing lots of queries at them and seeing what kind of responses come back. But that doesn't facilitate really consumer choice. Like you don't get to really pick products that have alignment with your values because you don't know what values went into that, what decisions went into that. And it's the thing where that we don't get to have a democratic discussion on what should be the baseline level of safety for these products.
It sounds like you're advocating at the very least for transparency.
It's the way you start conversations. You know, we can't have the most basic market incentives if people don't actually get to choose between products. And the thing that we saw with social media was we got these huge network effects, which means that people didn't really get to make choices. They got locked into systems. But even then, they didn't really know what they were choosing because there was a difference between the narrative that was said publicly and how the systems actually performed. When it comes to generative AI, we should expect a lot more competition because there is less of that protective moat and because the cost for development is relatively lower. But unless we have mandated ways for researchers, for governments, for activists to be able to probe these systems, what kinds of values were baked into the system by their alignment team?
Right. Actually, just to build on that even further, I think beyond the transparency, to be able to see what's happening there, one thing that we care very much about at Block Party is having access to these systems programmatically such that we can build additional tooling. So it's no longer just seeing what's there and what's already been built by the companies, but being able to build different experiences. Without API access to some of these social media platforms, we're just locked into whatever Facebook wants us to do, whatever TikTok wants to show us, whatever Twitter wants to show us. And there's actually no possibility for choice. Even if you have transparency, you can see what they're doing, but there's no way for other people to build alternative experiences. You still don't have choice. You just know that you are locked into the one thing. So we care very much about getting that sort of programmatic access to build different consumer solutions as well.
And Tracy, I'm just now seeing with Blue Sky, this new Twitter competitor, which I know you're on as well. They're inching towards some of the values and features that you at Block Party have already offered, that you've kept your users protected on social networks like Twitter and other places where they're facing harassment. It's one of the few areas where I'm seeing like incremental improvement. So I'm wondering what advice can you give, or what can you tell us about where pressure was put on stakeholders to start to try to, to make companies see that they needed to start to change, to offer something different, to offer some control to users?
There's a bunch of different ways to try to make a point and create change. One of them in this space was just showing that it's not that hard to make things better. And I've actually talked to a lot of now former Twitter employees who said it was really powerful to see Block Party build on top of the Twitter API and create such a better experience for users in a very simple way, where internally at a lot of different platform companies, trust and safety folks have run into the hurdles of being told, like, it's just a hard problem, like we can't make it any better, like we're doing our best, we just can't do any better. And I almost single-handedly built, like literally coded all of this for Block Party. It was like, it's actually not that hard. Like a single developer with a little bit of like, you know, a little bit of resourcing can actually build an experience that's meaningfully better without any really specially privileged access. So I think even just like that proof point of it can be better unlocked a lot of possibility in people's minds around like what they could be doing. I think the other thing was showing platforms that they don't have to be the ones to solve all of the problems. Clearly, they have a lot of responsibility, and there are some things that really only the platform is positioned to do, and there are some things that a centralized actor may need to take charge of. So things like misinformation or like really harmful speech about a single person that's directing a lot of hate towards them, like some of that needs to be taken down at a platform level. But there's a lot of other things that the platform doesn't need to be involved with. So like individual user controls, the platforms may not want to build out all of this tooling themselves. It's a lot of end product design work, a lot of resourcing that has to go into some of these different feature sets and consumer experiences. And there are other people who want to build these solutions. One thing that was a big learning for me going to more international conferences and speaking to people in journalism and politics in a more global setting was the frustration from folks that everything that Facebook and Twitter does is very US centric, like maybe a little bit of EU. But there's all these other folks that are like, there's like one representative in all of South America to deal with like a certain set of, you know, elections issues. Like that's ridiculous. And there's a lot of like local organizations, local developers that want to be able to build this tooling, but are locked out right now. And so having that access could just empower so many different use cases, different locales, languages, contexts. And I think, again, just sort of the proof point that we made of we can build this tool, look how much more could be possible was very useful as showing like a path forward around some really gnarly problems that we've been struggling with for a long time.
And to build on kind of that little flavor in there, we've been living with a model of how we should think about these platforms where we're very passive. You know, like Ethan Zuckerman at UMass Amherst like has this metaphor that we've been living in a world where we have been subjects of kings. You know, we live on these systems where we don't get any say. If we don't like the rules, we can go to another kingdom, but like we're just choosing another king. Like we're not really having a different relationship. I think the thing that's so exciting about what Tracy's doing is in order for efforts to facilitate more people taking hands-on action, is that I think there is a future for social media where we are citizens, we are not subjects, where we expect to do things like jury duty. We expect to play a role in keeping systems safe, instead of just having this idea that we have to accept whatever the baseline is. Because like she said, the version of Facebook you use if you speak English and live in the United States is the cleanest, safest version in the world. And that's intentional. If we want to have systems that are linguistically equitable and scale for the amount of linguistic diversity in the world, we have to use models like what Tracy's doing.
You know, Frances, the way that these American multinationals, Facebook in particular, operate in the global South was something that, you know, you really tried to highlight. You know, now with the layoffs in big tech, we're seeing companies in particular cut back on their content efforts, you know, in some of these countries. And I am wondering, what do you think will happen? What do you think, is there a way to prevent what I guess we all kind of anticipate is going to happen?
So I always like to say I am a pessimist in the short term and an optimist in the long term. So one of the ways we have historically corrected when we have invented new forms of media is it has been very, very, very bad for a period of time. And then we make decisions that we don't want to do that anymore. And I was really, really shocked. I think it was last year when the Kenya TikTok riots happened. So there was an election in Kenya. There was ethnic violence that was facilitated or amplified because of misinformation and violence inciting content on TikTok. And I had thought we were going to have 5 years before we would see that kind of thing. Video takes much more bandwidth, which means it's more expensive. You need higher quality phones. It doesn't have the same penetration that Facebook does. Like Facebook is the internet in many countries in Africa, for example, because they have a stripped down, very bare bones version of Facebook where you can interact with text and pictures. And what's terrifying is TikTok is because it separates out the actual relationships between people, because it's so much more facilitated by this kind of all-knowing, all-seeing algorithm. It's a system that really is only safe when it is actively censored. When you have systems that you can pull from hundreds of millions of videos, and the algorithm is tuned specifically to make things go super viral. They want a very small number of pieces of content, a few thousand, say, making up the vast majority of what everyone sees. And they do that intentionally because in places like China or in the United States, they go and they manually screen all those most viral items. But in places like, Kenya, I've heard from people on the inside, they didn't have any Swahili speaking moderators while that violence was going on. And part of what I found horrifying about the last 6 months was Facebook, in the wake of my disclosures, seemed to invest more in safety. But because their stock has been flagging, Mark Zuckerberg decided that this was going to be their year of efficiency. And they've done things like halve the number of moderators in East Africa. And so I'm really worried that we have built closed private systems and then done incentives to make it such that they are the internet in some of the most vulnerable places in the world. And then we've chosen not to invest in safety for them. And I have a book coming out this summer called The Power of One, where I go in great detail to how this happened and why it's happening. And I think unless we do decentralized systems where we really have the users playing an active role in safety, we're not going to build technologies that can scale to the 4,000 or 5,000 languages that exist in the world.
And do you think that that's something that tech companies would allow? Access to users to moderate their own systems?
Well, I think it's this question of how many people are going to die before we do these things, right? Like it's one of these things where we have, when I joined Facebook, there had been a social media facilitated genocide, Myanmar. It wasn't the opinion of random people inside the company or random people on the internet. Like the UN came out and said this was a social media facilitated genocide. During just the time period I was at Facebook, we also had Ethiopia take place. And we should expect to see more and more of these incidences happen over the next few years as more people come online, as things like video become more and more present, images become more and more present. It sounds weird to us sitting in the United States with fancy smartphones, but there's lots, for billions of people on the internet, they're just moving into a world where they can have regular access to lots of video. I think it's in many problems, there is a body count that we accept until we don't accept it anymore. And I think the thing that is so tragic is I think a lot of people are going to die before we hit that line and we start saying, okay, we have to figure out solutions to scale because we're just going to see more mass casualty events.
Right. I think that's sort of, to be realistic. I mean, I back to sort of what Tracy was talking about with the trade-offs. That was really helpful insight into, you both have worked inside these big tech companies, and I think that was a much more realistic look at what the discussions that are actually happening, right? Like no one's saying we want to take away your privacy. It's always going to be a trade-off. Like Tracy, could you give a little bit of insight into how those discussions happen inside a tech company in a way that might help us really understand?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add into the conversation we're just having about when is this going to change? When is this going to be fixed? I think it is a question that we can answer by looking at the system incentives. And right now, it's almost purely these capitalist incentives of have more engagement, drive more advertiser impressions, and make more money in that way. And we're willing to tolerate some casualties along the fringes if the stock price is still going up or if there's enough money. A couple ways to try to intervene in this system are regulation, where there's a cost associated with this. I've actually talked to trust and safety folks who are like, we're actually really excited about regulation coming in where there will be a dollar cost associated with our work. So instead of it being a feel-good effort, it's like, no, we are the team that's responsible for making sure we don't incur these massive fines that actually have an impact on the bottom line of the business. So that's one way in which we can try to intervene. Other things that I would look at in terms of like, what are the system incentives beyond the more capitalist side? Look at what are the KPIs that companies set and how do individual actors orient around the company level KPIs, key performance indicators. How do they set goals? A lot of tech companies use OKRs, objectives and key results, that they look at on an individual basis, team basis, all the way up to company basis on a quarterly level. And it turns out that a lot of our incentives are aligned around solving certain types of problems. And you get more promotions and a better chance at career advancement if you work on certain types of problems, and less so if you work on others. So, I have heard from some of the folks who worked on health and safety teams that their teams weren't the ones that you would go to if you wanted to be promoted. Like, if you want to get promoted, you go work on an infrastructure team where you're going to work on something that affects the entire user base, and you get to write in your self-performance rating when you're going up for promotion that you worked on something that impacted 1 billion users, and you drove key metrics for the company around like advertiser dollars a certain way. It's not as impactful to the business if it's like, oh, we did this many takedowns of bad content. Like, it is a metric that you can point to, but the more that your personal goals are tied to the company goals, the better off you are. So I think it really is looking at all of these incentives within the company, not just sort of like the business incentives, but also the individual incentives around how do they get career advancement, how do they get influence, and trying to solve the structural incentives, which may be regulation coming in to at least put like a big dollar at the very top, so that these teams have a real justification for their work.
Do you think that they are just, they're also like that is related to what they choose to measure? Like, if they could choose to measure the way that Instagram made you feel, right? Like, or is that, are those things hard to measure?
I think it's harder to measure, but ultimately it has to tie to what is the business rationale for these things. So you might have your key objectives that you're trying to optimize, and you might have guardrail metrics as well, but you're not optimizing those guardrail metrics. Like, it's much more likely you would see, I haven't worked at Instagram, but it's much more likely you would see if they're trying to increase engagement while trying to make sure that people aren't too unhappy. So maybe like happiness or mental health is a guardrail metric, but it's not going to be the thing that they optimize. Which also is an interesting segue into looking at like more the consumer choice side of things. If there are more open APIs so that other companies, like my own Block Party, we're building different experiences. Like, our goal is to optimize for the end user and making them happy. Like, our goal is actually aligned with the user experience and their incentives as opposed to the platform incentives. And so some of the possibility here with regulation enforcing some level of openness, we are already starting to see some of this in the EU with the DMA requirements around open APIs for interoperability. It's opening up this possibility for more consumer experiences that are actually aligned to end users and giving them more choice instead of being locked into whatever makes the most sense for the platform companies.
I think there's also a question of like, a lot of these things are probabilistic future costs versus immediate costs, right? So like, if you're sitting there and saying like, there's a high chance that this forest fire is going to come through, but the forest fire is going to come through sometime between now and 5 years from now. And you're likely only going to stay at the company for 2 or 3 years. It's very hard for you to fight that fight when you may never pay that cost. And so you have a situation where I think a lot of trust and safety people end up in situations where the thing that keeps us safe is literally the goodwill of trust and safety people. They voluntarily are slowing their careers down. They're voluntarily often putting up with headaches that they wouldn't face if they were working in, say, the growth part of the company or the ads part of the company. And you have these really dangerous trade-offs where inside of Facebook, the turnover is so fast. By the time I left, so I was there for about 2 years, I was more senior than like 85% of the company. So in a world where like you have very quick turnover, do you really want the optimization for society as a whole to be made by someone who's not likely going to be around to actually pay for the costs of not putting out the forest or like, you know, trimming the undergrowth in the forest?
How can we put the pressure on the folks who stay there because it pays for them to stay there, who have the objectives that are, you know, that are the best rewarded, you know, who maybe work in growth or, yeah, like you both understand, you know, how these companies work. You've talked to the advocates, you are the advocates, like where can we as consumers or outsiders throw our attention or our voices?
So given I'm guessing a lot of your audience is going to be in the United States and likely speaks English, given I'm speaking to them in English right now. I want to draw attention to the fact that Europe passed something called the Digital Services Act last year. And we could pass a law like that in the United States. So the Digital Services Act says, hey, you know, we have these opaque systems. They know that as long as they can hide behind the curtain, they can optimize for their own business objectives. And you know, people aren't aware that their corners being cut. Like they're not aware that the forest now hasn't been maintained in years, and that it's, you know, it's full of kindling. We have a right as consumers that if they know there's a risk, they should tell us. And that sounds so basic. It sounds so basic to be like, hey, if you know you're poisoning us, you need to tell us. But like, that's literally what the law says, that you have to do mandatory risk assessments. And if you don't consider a risk, we're allowed to ask you about it. And what's your plan for making that risk smaller? Oh, and by the way, if we ask you for data, you can't go and say, sorry, we're not going to give it to you anymore. Like you have to engage in a conversation with us. And so the thing I'm always trying to remind people is that we can have different relationships with these platforms. And like, that's the piece of hope I always try to leave people with, is that we shouldn't take for granted that powerlessness is inevitable, right? Or powerlessness is the only way we can have relationships with these companies. We don't accept children dying in car accidents for preventable reasons. We shouldn't accept that these companies are allowed to operate carte blanche just because that's the way we did it 20 years ago.
Yeah, I would just say +1. But I do like the focus on legislation, regulation, and pushing people to think about being involved in that process. You don't need to be the one necessarily writing the policy, but flagging that this is important to your representatives and pushing them to think critically about how they can solve some of these problems in a more structural way. I think that's likely the way that we'll have most persistent change. If you're relying on the goodwill of people within companies when they're going to have their own incentives as well, like they need to feed their families and like pay off loans or whatever it is, like that goodwill will only last so long if you want to build these structural solutions. And I think right now we have the law as one way that we can try to affect that. So there's much more that we can do within the US, modeling after what the EU is doing. In some cases, actually just general like consumer sentiment can sway platforms as well. I'm thinking about some of the cases with Instagram where they were trying to roll out changes to make them more like TikTok, and a lot of the influencers were very upset about this and spoke up against it, and at least got Instagram to like think a little bit differently about what they were rolling out. It's harder, I think, to affect change in that way because it kind of relies on getting a few key decision makers at these platform companies to think that you have like a credible threat. If it's celebrities like Taylor Swift threatening to leave your platform, then it matters. I don't know how much like a bunch of like individual users will impact the platforms unless it becomes at a scale that is impossible to ignore.
Right. Yeah. For so long that felt like, you know, asking consumers to make a personal choice when it's a structural issue. But I don't know, all of a sudden it feels like there might be enough momentum that like we could maybe choose with our feet. Yeah.
My dream, and I you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in my life, so who knows if I'll get around to this. But my dream in the next like year or two is we should be like gluing ourselves to the highway outside of Facebook, right? Like that's the level of crisis we're in. Like we're in the crisis. Like if you knew there was a Holocaust coming, you knew there were millions of people that were going to die. Like what would you do? And I think that's the thing that we really need in the United States is that these are I was in France, and they throw this phrase around much more freely than we do in the United States. They're digital colonial companies. They extract huge amounts of money across other countries. They leave all the externalities, all the costs behind, and people are going to die. People are dying. And so there's this question of like, what is it going to take for us to stand up in the big tech's backyard and say, like, this is unacceptable. Like, I'm not like, I think we're going to look back and we have an opportunity now to not be horrified by what happened. And so that's my hope. So come glue yourself to the highway with me. It'll be fun. It'll be a sunny day. The weather's always nice in Menlo Park. It'll be fine.
That's true. It's a great view, right outside that. Look at
the bay is beautiful.
Yeah,
just saying.
All right, thank you both for making the time. Now I'll turn to Danielle Citron, a legal scholar on cyber harassment and the author of The Fight for Privacy. Danielle, pleasure to speak with you today. I would like to start just by talking to you about, what do you think is the most, your biggest priority for the potential harms that you think big tech is posing for society right now? Like, what is your focus for this year?
So I've been writing about the privacy that's afforded our intimate life. So the privacy, of course, of our bodies, our thoughts, our health, our sexual orientation, sexual activities, and our close relationships. And I think I hope that our conversation centers on intimate privacy and just its centrality to our flourishing, to our engagement, to our ability to love and to connect with other people and to make the most out of all these tools that promise us that they're good for us, right? We use all these tools and services, our browsers, our apps, our digital, assistants. And the idea is that like, they're going to make our lives easier and better. And what we woefully underestimate and really just can't appreciate because of the scale, because we don't see data kind of flying out of our heads and hands, is that it provides the most intimate detail of our bodies, our pregnancies, our termination of pregnancies, where we go, who we're sleeping with, what we're doing, what we're reading, what we're thinking and fantasizing, and all of that is weaponized, especially against the most vulnerable, right? So I'm worried about so much of what we go about our daily lives thinking we have intimate privacy. We want it, we expect it, and we don't have it. And it's not only just companies, individuals, companies, but companies are the handmaidens to government. And in an era where, our reproductive choices in 13 states, could either lead to the arrest of health providers, ourselves, meaning people terminating pregnancies, lawsuits against people helping them terminate a pregnancy, which we have seen already. I feel like I'm in mortal terror every day. And in a way that feels so immediate to me, but I think it's really hard for people to appreciate because it's not visceral. We don't see it as the data flies out of our hands, as it's recorded in our apps. Does that make sense? Like, we don't see the reservoirs of intimate data and government's access to it and private companies, but it is there and it's being exploited.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this before, but I find like your experience having researched this and talked to so many individuals through the years. Could you talk a little bit about like how, it's so easy, right, when there's emerging technology to imagine the potential harms. And can you talk about how, when deepfakes first came out, some of the harms you imagine and how it actually played out?
Absolutely. Sort of when Bobby Chesney and I first started writing about deepfakes in, I want to say February of 2018, he's a national security scholar. I write about privacy, democracy, equality. And I said to him, Bobby, there's no question to me that downstream national security, democracy, we've got big stuff coming, but who's going to be the canary in the coal mine, which was true then and remains true today, are women, right? Women and, women of color, celebrities, non-celebrities, whose faces are morphed into porn in an incredibly hyper-realistic way, appear online and in ways that we have no control over. And, when we first started writing about it, 2018, 2019, I think there was something like 20,000 deepfakes online and 98% of them were of women's faces morphed into porn. And here we are, we're 2023. 2022, a study came out from Sensity. It was something like more than 60,000 deepfakes were detected online. 95% again were of essentially created manufactured porn, and 98% or 99% of those faces were female presenting faces, right? And so in a way, like the fact of the matter is, like, who does it mostly cost in the moment? You know, we often see intimate privacy violations, and who's first are the most vulnerable, right? And it's not to say we're not going to see it, and we're already seeing it. Mischief, corporate mischief, use of audio, like faked audio saying, send me a wire, right? Or, faked audio here again, like we're seeing the deepfake phenomenon weaponized in what Bobby and I call the liar's dividend, which was where you see a real video. It's genuine, it's of mischief. And someone says, it's all fake, right? Like it's a deep fake. And so it's true that we're increasingly seeing the threats propagate in all sorts of ways, right? Democracy invading, CEO like destroying lives, of companies, emptying bank accounts. But it's true that like where you first see it in the, misuses of technology is often the first victims are the easiest, right? Whose bodies aren't, there aren't, what do they say, bulletproof, they're the ones who are going to be, their bodies are viewed as disgusting and stigmatized.
Mm-hmm. And how are you finding having these conversations with the companies, with lawmakers, here in 2023? It feels increasingly difficult to have grounded conversations as we're trying to imagine the potential of this technology. And as you said, the problems with deep fakes, they're only increasing. So how are you finding receptiveness to these ongoing harms to women and women of color?
So interesting, because when I first started writing about the phenomenon in 2019, there were like, I had testified before Congress, like in 2 committee hearings. We saw it as like an imminent threat to national security. So it was I was before the HPSC committee, the Permanent Select Intelligence Committee, and things have kind of quieted. That is, we saw some state legislatures like make some moves, banning like deep fakes around an election, like within 48 hours, and also deep fake sex videos. So this, manufactured digital forgeries of where we're depicting someone involved in a sex act. A couple of states, I think there's 6 in total or 7. But things have been quite quiet, and it disturbs me, right? It's not as if things have gotten less significant. They've grown or tripled, quadrupled in number in the ways that are detectable. They're very familiar problems. We have seen there's one proposal in Congress, what we call, Dr. Marianne Franks has been working on behalf of our organization called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative with a lawmaker in the House to think about ways to penalize digital forgeries that are defamatory, like in a careful and narrow way. But it's interesting because it's been quite quiet in ways that are surprising, the inverse of like problem set overreaction. Like we predicted problems, they weren't as prevalent. People were really interested. Let's legislate, let's work 2019. And all of a sudden, here we are. I guess you're not surprised at all, having covered this feed for so long, 2023. And it seems with the exception of like one House representative, and maybe it's dysfunction in government, but it's quite quiet, though the problem keeps escalating, and the deep fakery audio and video getting even more sophisticated in ways. And like, now you have deep fakes as a service. So like it costs you nothing, like $50, you get exactly what you want. The person doing exactly what you want them to be doing, which could be like ultra human, you know what I mean? Like, and really disfiguring awful things that you can create. And so the problem's gotten worse. I worry that, and you asked about companies too, companies have worked terrific, like Johnny on the Spot in the moment, 2019, when we saw increasing prevalence and discussion about deep fakery, and they adopted, the biggest platforms, policies against fabricated, digitally, altered video and audio. But it's kind of stopped, right? So it's not to say that the phenomenon has stopped. We saw some moves, Twitter, Meta, then Facebook, other companies, TikTok absolutely bans digital forgeries. But there are 9,500 sites whose raison d'etre is intimate image abuse, and they're not banning it. That's their business model. And so does that make sense? Like some of the biggest platforms, and I'm not saying bravo, but glad they're working with us on it, right? Some of the biggest ones. But at the same time, you've got a whole ecosystem of sites who are immune from liability under federal law, and they thrive. They have subscribers. They earn money from our data, whether they're called Mr. Deepfakes, Anon IB. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a whole ecosystem of sites who make so much money off of the fakery that's usually aimed at women and people of color and sexual and gender minorities.
Do you have a sense, since you have such you have so much expertise in this area and such a sense of this ecosystem, is there an area where advocates or consumers could put pressure on stakeholders that would make a real difference, especially if we're seeing legislators just kind of take this wait and see approach with women's safety?
Yeah, no, and I've one inspire. I feel like so I have a new book, The Fight for Privacy, that, you know, it's sort of the bleak story, but like end with some hope. And what I can say is we can bring moral suasion to the table in ways we don't even realize we have so much power. But South Korea is like an incredible example. So in 2018, basically women and girls couldn't go to the public bathrooms without being recorded and then having it be streamed online. And women who would have to bring, if they did go to the bathroom, like what they called molka kits, which is it would have silicone, you'd fill in like any holes in the bathroom, pre-pandemic masks, you know, they had like provisions. And basically you didn't pee. You did not go to the restroom. And this is where like I'm just kind of overwhelmed with admiration. Women and allies and girls and their allies took to the streets 5 times in 2018. The first march was something like 25,000 people in Seoul. 2 months later, 45,000 people. And they all had signs in English and Korean that said, "My life is not your porn." So it was really designed for a global conversation, not just Korea, you know, like a conversation, not just their law enforcement, not just their parliament and, you know, but for everyone. And 2 months later after that, 50,000 people. After that, 75,000. And the final march, so this is the 5th, it's December, it's 2018, it's freezing. 125,000 people took to the streets of Seoul to say, "My life is not your porn." No more filming me in the bathroom, and no more calling it a joke. Molka is like a jokey name for hidden camera in Korean. And the Korean government created what's called the Digital Sex Crime Content Commission. It's amazing. I've been working with them ever since. They listen to their advocates in Korea, and instead of calling it molka, which is like a joke, like a hidden camera, haha, they call it, as advocates wanted, digital sex crime information or content. And it's like a whole society approach. Like they support, so victims or individuals who, you know, they get support for psychiatric help with jobs if they've lost their jobs, which is often the case. They lose their job, the filmer, you know, irrelevant, they're never caught. Law enforcement is now have increased enhanced penalties. They're enforcing those laws. They now have a liability that relates to platforms hosted in Korea. So now, though it's hard because so much of the content is hosted outside the US. You know, like that's their biggest struggle, is like these sites that are hosted mostly in the US, Russia and the Netherlands, right? These 9,500 sites. But I've been so impressed, you know, you asked, like, what can we do? Is there any way, if lawmakers are going to sit on their hands, and I think you beautifully said it, wait and see. You know what I mean? Like if the pressure's not on, they're just going to be like, well, let's see what happens, which it does feel like in this moment, that's what's happening. We can take to the streets, like whether we need a spark. Remember with Jennifer Lawrence and the fappening, when her nude photos and other celebrities' photos were leaked to the cloud and then exploited on Reddit and 4chan and 8chan. And, you know, she speaks out and speaks to Vanity Fair and said this was a virtual sexual assault. Like, I don't want that. I don't want to have that moment, right? Like where very high profile people are exploited. But whatever it is, we need to take to the streets, because if they could do it in Korea, we can do it here. Does that make sense? Like I have such belief in us. Like if we've seen it, you know what I mean? Like I really do. Right. We saw
getting chills. Like I do. And, you know, think about how much Reddit has transformed since that time. Like it was seen as a joke. You know, it took so long for it to be seen as assault, as a crime. The whole platform has transformed in a way, you know, since then. So I think that also shows
and they're
that
doing better. They were not great for a while. Like there were sites I used to report it. Poor Steve Hoffman. I'm busy writing to him too. Like, dude, there are NCII subreddits, like, but they have cracking down on them now. And the deep fake, you know, Mr. Deepfake started on the subreddit, right, in 2018, and they took that down. You're right. So they've been proactive. They could always do better at scale. They could always do better, but it is encouraging, right? So if we can bug those folks, right, and their business model is engagement, if we can bring moral suasion to them to say it's not good for business, right, we're going to protest, then I think we can. Like, I'm not giving up on us, the public, right? Us, you know, advocates together as a project.
That's wonderful. I think that's a great place to end it. I'm persuaded. Thank you, Danielle, so much for making the time. We really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for having me and for all your brilliant coverage. I really appreciate it.
I hope you all have been enjoying these terrific conversations. Now it's my great honor to introduce a special performance from the Indigo Girls. Folk rock duo Amy Ray and Emily Saliers have been performing together since the 1970s and have won multiple Grammys for their soulful music.
Hey, this is Amy Ray. And I'm Emily. We're the Indigo Girls. And we're thrilled to be joining you virtually for the 19th Represents Summit. I love the 19th. I'm a subscriber, and it's awesome. Here's a little song that we recorded backstage for y'all to sing along with. Keep bringing out the truth, y'all. 1, 2, ready, and... Take my life.
I'm Nadra Niddle, education reporter at the 19th. We're now talking about labor and tech. We're joined by Amanda Ballantyne, Executive Director of the AFL-CIO's Technology Institute. Thanks for making the time, Amanda.
Thanks, Nadra. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. You were named the first director of the Technology Institute in 2021, and I was wondering if you could tell me what the Technology Institute does and how does it use tech and innovation to advance the labor movement?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your show. The AFL-CIO, first of all, to let you know, the AFL-CIO is a federation of 60 international labor unions that really cover every sector of the US economy, from entertainment and sports to manufacturing to education. The AFL-CIO Technology Institute is a new project that we launched about 2 years ago now. And the focus of it is to really understand the impacts of emerging technologies on work and the role of labor unions and other worker rights organizations in helping workers navigate changes in work caused by different technological changes. In different industries, that looks different. In manufacturing, we look at things like the impact of 3D printing and advanced robotics. In education, we're trying to understand how different applications and maybe even artificial intelligence technologies impact the teaching profession. Same in sports and entertainment and other unions. Each part of the economy has technologies that are always sort of driving forward, and we're helping workers and their unions really understand how to navigate and make sure that those technologies are working for working people.
Thank you for explaining that. Now, I know one thing that's been in the news a lot recently is ChatGPT, and I was wondering if you could discuss that and its role in labor. I know you just mentioned teachers, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ChatGPT is interesting, and I think I'm not sure that anybody really anticipated what a big splash it would have and how quickly the technology would roll out. And so, of course, it's all over the news, and there's a lot of fear and concern about it, a lot of effort to really understand what it is, what it does, and how it will impact work. What it is it's a large language model that is, surveying the internet and really sort of drawing all of from the information on the internet to produce quick, real-time answers that sort of synthesize information. And if you've explored it or tried it out, you'll see that you can ask it anything from like, write me a haiku about the labor movement to explain how these two political theorists would talk to each other about a particular topic. So it's a surprising technology to roll out and how quickly it can generate those answers. And I think that the impact that it'll have on different areas of work is really varied, and we're just learning it. I was talking to some colleagues in the startup space recently and saying, like, what we're seeing right now is an experiment in real time of how this technology will impact different sectors. Most employers don't really understand what it is or how it works, how it might benefit or hurt their business. And employers are really sort of figuring those things out. I mean, with the exclusion of large tech firms, of course. But that's having an impact on real people and real people's lives, right? And it takes time for people to be able to navigate those changes and understand those shifts. I think from the labor movement's perspective, we are always looking at how we protect workers, how we help them train and upskill to be able to embrace and use new technologies. And so the adoption of technology is something we're really interested in helping working people understand how to use technology to make their jobs better and safer. But we are also very concerned about, technologies that cause sort of large scale disruption and, layoffs and really big, fast shifts in industry. And that's how we're looking at ChatGPT. It's both things. How can we help workers figure out how to integrate it into their work in a way that makes sense? How do we make sure that as employers are trying to figure out how to use generative artificial intelligence technologies in the workplace, we're not having just massive impacts on jobs? And so that's what I think in a general way I would say about it. I do think in education it's interesting, right? Because both teachers are figuring out how they can use it, but they're also experiencing students trying to figure out how to use it. And, there have been concerns about plagiarism. There have been concerns about sort of copying and cheating, and how do you actually sort of guarantee that someone's work is actually their work? I think that as we see the technology be adopted in real time, what you'll see is it starting to be used as a tool, like Wikipedia, or like Cliff's Notes, frankly, that can be like on more varied topics, but it will challenge students, I think, to work harder and develop their ideas further, right? I mean, that's the hope. But I think in the meantime, we really have to pay attention to the human impact of these technologies. And it does take time to figure out how they work and how they will change the way we do our work, and making sure what we call it a just transition exists for working people, where if their job is de-skilled, or if they lose their job because of an automation technology like generative AI, that we have pathways both through unions and collective bargaining, but also through public policy to help them train, upskill, and find new jobs of similar quality, in the place where they live.
Yeah, and you mentioned the human impact of technology. So I was wondering if you could discuss the role of technology in labor negotiations.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's so interesting about the labor movement. We have a process called collective bargaining that works differently in different sectors, but in general, what it does is create worker voice for wages, hours, working conditions, and it creates a more democratic workplace. So unions have been negotiating and bargaining over the impact of technology for 120 years in the United States. President Schuler, who's the president of the AFL-CIO, often talks about how the IBEW, which is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, really sort of tamed electricity. And when electricity was a new technology, it was wild, it was dangerous, it was unregulated. And you can see pictures of 100 electrical wires going into one building, and you think, oh my God, that is going to start on fire. And it did. And a lot of people were hurt, and inequities were caused. But it was really the IBEW both helping workers with on-site safety, but also really advocating for workplace regulations. That union played an enormous role in turning electricity into an everyday technology that's safe to use, that's well regulated. And it's same in the auto industry. When you think about the ways that cars have developed and changed over time, really unions have played an important role in helping figure out how to make those technologies easier and faster to make. But it all, I think, comes down to this process of bargaining and making sure that workers' rights, interests, and safety are represented at the bargaining table. I think often in our society, in the way that our labor law works, we end up bargaining over the effects of technology, because technology really doesn't, it impacts, what would I would say? I would say since World War II, there's been this massive public investment in creating research and development streams that lead to the types of technologies we have now, from the iPhone to the computer to internet. And workers have not been a part of that. That's been public investment in universities and firms and a partnership to do basic and advanced research. And we at the Technology Institute are looking for ways to bring workers into that research and development structure. So instead of experiencing technology as it's sort of commercialized and sort of just comes into your workplace, that we actually think that workers have a role, not just in the workplace in adopting technology through bargaining processes, but also in the research and design of that technology, right? And so we think about both things. How do we use our contract negotiation process to make sure that workers are trained and upskilled and protected as new technologies are introduced? But also, how can we bring workers and their knowledge and expertise into the research and development process to improve technology and make sure that it's human-centered technology?
And yeah, thanks for explaining that. And I think one thing that's related is, labor laws and related laws. I know the Technology Institute has said that our laws haven't caught up to the technology yet. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, how behind our laws, our federal laws, or even state and local laws behind the technology that's being generated every day.
particularly labor law is a specific body of law in our country that governs how unions and employers interact. And it is the case that over the past 40 years, labor law has been really narrowed in a way that makes it very, very difficult for workers in the private sector to organize. And what that means is that, you know, organizing and getting a contract creates it creates a conversation and a set of rights for workers in their workplace that gives workers an amount of power in saying, you know, what their wages and hours and working conditions should be, but also how the job should be done. We believe in the labor movement that workers are as expert in how to do their jobs as any engineer who's designing technology for a workplace. And that's because it's workers who at the end of the day are using the technology. They're the end user, so they know what works, what doesn't work, where they have to troubleshoot technologies. So I think that when we talk about emergent technologies and how weak private sector labor law is in this country, that should concern all of us, because unions are a core way, like I said before when I was describing the IBEW's relationship to electrification at the beginning of the 20th century. So we really all as a society need to be focused on making labor law better in this country so that workers have more power to bargain and negotiate. That will make technology adoption better for everyone. It'll make our society more equitable, less polarized. When it comes to laws and regulations that are governing technologies like artificial intelligence or machine learning or other types of digital technologies, it isn't necessarily that we don't have frameworks for governing those types of technologies and how they interact with people and people's rights, but it is that these technologies are different and they cross-cut different areas of law, and that we don't yet have adequate enforcement systems. So I do think it's the case that we urgently need new legislation and regulation that is looking at aspects of how artificial intelligence, machine learning, those types of technologies impact work, impact democratic processes, impact consumer rights, privacy, surveillance, policing, you know, all of these things that are just really core to our fundamental civil and human rights in the United States and globally. But it's also the case that, well, first of all, whatever we do in the United States around these technologies will impact the rest of the world. So I think there's a global interest in that. But also I think it's the case that as we're thinking of how to actually govern these technologies, really being serious about how to enforce that governance. Because these technologies are adapting and changing over time. They're coming out with new capabilities that are surprising even to the developers who are creating them. And it's urgent, I think, that we're thinking not only about what are the right frameworks for regulating, the rights-based frameworks for regulating these technologies, but also how do we make sure that our government can enforce those rights and sort of comprehend and represent the rights of regular people. A lot of these technologies are really complicated. A lot of them are really protected by intellectual property law. And if we can't tell what is in an algorithm, how it's functioning, it's really hard to tell whether it's biased, whether it's sort of creating negative outcomes, right? And so it's, I think there's a lot of effort right now to really start to think through that in the United States. And I think that it's pretty urgent that we move that conversation forward soon.
Thank you. And I know the Technology Institute is concerned about how companies are hiding behind technology in some ways to exploit workers. But I was also wondering if you can discuss, so this is kind of a two-part question, if you can discuss how workers are leveraging technology to their advantage. For example, we heard so much about the Great Resignation about a year ago, and how even workers who maybe did not resign demanded that they be allowed to have more flexibility. So whether that was working remotely all the time, part of the time, or whatever arrangement they came to, and how this was especially important to caregivers, to parents who need that flexibility to be more present for their children or other family members. So I was wondering if you can discuss that. So both, how are companies hiding behind technology to exploit workers, and how have workers leveraged technology to demand more flexibility?
It's a great question. And I like the sort of like two approaches to it. I'll start by saying that given the massive amount of public investment that's gone into like creating these technologies, workers who pay taxes, who then are funding that research and have for the past, 50 years, should expect some return on their investment. And we think of that in terms of equity. So when we have new technologies introduced, it should also create better working conditions, more money, safer working conditions for workers. They should also benefit in very clear and tangible ways. The concept of flexibility is so interesting. And it's so interesting because of the way that technology is enabling us to have really different social relations around work, around family, around kind of where we live. And I think you're right. I think that platform-based companies, we can say sort of in the transportation and delivery space, for example, are sort of really advertising the jobs in those sectors as flexible. And they're saying they're flexible because this app gives people the ability to be independent contractors and set their own hours and conditions. It's questionable whether they actually are allowing workers to set their own hours and conditions. And I think there's a lot of evidence that some of those companies, some of those jobs are really bad jobs and exploitive jobs. It's also just not true that you can't use technology to make that kind of flexibility available to W-2 employees who have regular jobs and are covered by labor and employment law in the United States. So it's sort of like this bait and switch where they say, hey, if you want a flexible job, be an independent contractor on this app and don't have any rights, when in fact, any employer can use a platform technology to create flexibility in scheduling and self-scheduling for workers and other things that apps and platforms can provide while still providing W-2 employment situation, which is what gives you worker rights in this country. And so I think that's an interesting conversation to have. And I think at the end of the day, we just need to be talking about what are our real values? Like, don't we want to take care of workers, and shouldn't we be using technology to make work better, easier, faster, safer for everybody? There are different kinds of efficiencies that businesses can find rather than just sort of exploiting workers by using technology. And that's what we're interested in this space.
Thank you for discussing that. And I was also hoping you could discuss kind of how exploitation might look different depending on the quote unquote class of worker. So for those who have jobs where technology plays a huge role, we're hearing more about how these workers are kind of expected to be on call all the time. So their working hours are not clearly defined. They're answering emails at all hours of the night or expected to, just be available 24/7. So can you talk about how exploitation might look different depending on the class of worker, I guess?
Yeah, another great question, really. And I think that especially if you look at jobs in big tech, there's a lot of hype about how much those jobs pay and the sort of like fringy benefits that come along with them. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of those jobs are really brutal and as exploitive as low wage work. The question of what workers need and want out of any job, it does animate how unions interact with workers and what they bargain for in those sectors. So, in high wage tech jobs that are abusive, it may not be that people are bargaining over salary, although I think gender and racial equity in those jobs is a big, like how do you have transparency so you can have equitable salaries? That's a big concern of workers in those sectors. But hours and expectations around time off and unscheduled work is a huge, it's job quality. I mean, it all comes down to job quality. I also think workers in tech are thinking of interesting ways that they can use collective bargaining to advance other concerns about like the social impacts of the technologies that they're creating. So in sort of big tech worker organizing, there's a lot of really interesting work in collaboration that workers are doing to really try and shape that industry to make it more humane, both for the workers in the industry, but also for the impacts of those technologies on our society. So it's a really interesting space to watch.
Yeah, and you mentioned salary briefly. And now one thing I've heard when I was asking earlier about flexibility, one thing I've heard about that is some companies have said, okay, you can work home 3 days a week, but or even 5 days a week, but we will dock your salary by 25% or 30% because now you no longer have to commute. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, companies that want to dock the salaries of remote workers.
I think that's a terrible idea. Companies do a lot of things to save money on their employees, and it's too bad that the way that companies look as employees are as sort of liabilities on the balance sheet. Again, like I would just say that there are many, many ways that employers can use technologies to find efficiencies by helping workers have more flexibility and have sort of better and safer jobs. And that creates a better work environment when workers are happy and they feel respected and they have a voice on the job. That's what creates a really sort of durable, deeply engaged workforce. And efforts to sort of nickel and dime workers around flexibility, I think, miss a bigger point, which is some people work better from home and have more flexibility. And in an industry where that kind of choice is available, workers should be bargaining to sort of protect their rights, and workers should be sort of collaborating with their employees to find out where their employers to find out where those other efficiencies can be.
And then, just going back to labor negotiations and the labor movement more generally, I'm based in California. Right now, the writers are on strike in Los Angeles. The teachers are on strike in Oakland. And I was wondering, what you think about how technology is being used in strikes, whether that's social media, hashtags, or people posting pictures and videos. How is technology helping striking workers get their message across?
The labor movement and the right to form, join, and organize a union in this country is a really, really powerful tool that regular people have to exert more control over their lives and to make their lives better. But I think for the past 30 or 40, 50 years, labor unions have really been under assault, both in terms of labor law, like I talked about earlier, but also the public narrative about unions is really off base and really, I think, driven by PR firms that make a lot of money by pushing anti-union rhetoric. Employers don't want unions because unions are powerful. One of the things that is so cool about the last few years and the sort of emergence of really powerful worker rights organizing and union organizing and the display of that on social media is that it's telling a really different story about what the labor movement is. And it explains, what a strike is to people who probably feel like they also wish they had a union and could go on strike. And it, I think, is like inspirational to the whole society in a way that we haven't really been able to see, like workers standing up in real time talking about these issues directly through social media. So that is like a very cool trend. I also think that when workers go on strike, often, the media, the story quickly turns to how annoying it might be to have a strike or how disruptive it is to industry. And that's not a dynamic that creates solidarity in a society, right? And so I think workers being able to tell their own stories and generate support kind of requires the media to tell a different story about strikes. And that's fair. And that we want to see more of that. I also just think that over social media in the past few years, we've seen so much actual workers organizing each other, workers with different types of workplaces, workers who are, in different parts of the country. And it's very, very cool to see that kind of like DIY get on social media and kind of build a movement.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you about, even though I'm a member of the media, about the media portrayal of strikes, because right now with the writer strike, for example, the narrative has been, oh, you may not be able to see your favorite TV shows anymore. And when the teachers are on a strike, the narrative is usually how it's going to inconvenience parents and not necessarily what the workers are striking for. And just switching gears a little bit, I was wondering if you could also discuss some of the partnerships the Technology Institute has. I know you have some partnerships with different academic institutions like Carnegie Mellon, and I was just wondering if you could talk about that and, you know, the work you all might be doing in the future.
Yeah, well, another good question. So many good questions in this interview. In the beginning of this interview, I sort of talked about how we really believe that right now we're in a situation where technology sort of happens to workers, and then we figure out how to bargain over the effects. Part of why we created the Technology Institute was to bring workers into the lab and to have them be co-collaborators in developing technology. There are a couple things that come from this. The first one is better technology. Again, because workers at the end of the day are the end users of most technology. They understand more than anyone else how work in their industry gets done, and they can provide just incredible insights to researchers who otherwise don't have that knowledge. And so really valuing the knowledge. I mean, you're a media practitioner, you know so many things about how to do your job that you couldn't tell if you were an engineer in a lab trying to think about how to build a news app, right? And same for someone who's an Uber or Lyft driver, or same for someone who's a teacher, right? You just know so much because you've done the job. And so that's part of just a belief that technology will be bettered and it will be more human-centered if workers are involved in shaping it. But the other thing that comes out of this partnership, particularly with Carnegie Mellon University, is that there's more transparency into understanding how technology will impact work. So for labor unions, seeing 5, 10, 15 years into the future of a technology helps us understand what to bargain over, how to train our workers, how to help them prepare for the future. It also can help employers or governments understand how to think about developing their workforce. So it takes some of the mysticism out of technology. So when we think about things like automated vehicles or 3D printing, those technologies will be developed, they'll be deployed. The question is, how will they be adopted and how will society react? And these partnerships that we have with universities around research and design really kind of help us build a better picture of how to advocate and protect workers as tech changes.
Yeah. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with the 19th. We really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
A big thank you to the Indigo Girls and to the rest of today's moderators and speakers. I also want to thank those who made this week possible, including our founding sponsors, the National Women's Law Center and the Stardust Fund, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation and the Tory Burch Foundation. We'd also like to thank our national media partner, the Washington Post, as well as our local partners, Block Club Chicago, CityCast Chicago, City Bureau, and the Chicago Independent Media Alliance. A final thanks to our academic partner, Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. And of course, thank you to all of you for tuning in. Be sure to come back tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for Day 2. We'll be talking about the intersection of gender and justice with New York Attorney General Tish James, maternal health advocate Christy Turlington Burns, Illinois Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, Me Too activist Tarana Burke, and many, many more. We'll see you tomorrow.